Hello everyone. Before we step into this story full of tears and courage, please hit that subscribe button and follow this story with me all the way to the very last minute. Don't forget to comment the city you're watching from so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. Clara Whitlow was on her knees in the mud when the gunshot cracked over Mercy Ridge, and she didn't move not an inch, because the man bleeding out under her hands mattered more than the rifle pointed at her back. "Get away from him, Clara!" Sheriff Boone's deputy screamed through the rain. "That man's wanted! He's dying!" Clara said, her voice flat as iron, pressing her apron hard against the stranger's ribs. "You want him dead so bad you shoot through me first." Nobody expected the widow to say that. Nobody expected her to mean it. The rain had come down for 3 days straight, before that night turning Mercy Ridge's one dirt road into a river of mud that swallowed boot heels and wagon wheels alike. Clara had been closing the shutters on her little sewing shop when she heard the horse a ragged, stumbling gait, nothing like the confident trot of a man who knew where he was going. She'd stepped out onto her porch with the lantern raised, the same lantern she lit every night for a husband and a son who would never walk up that road again, and she saw him. He came off the horse before the horse even stopped crumpling into the mud like a marionette with its strings cut. Clara didn't scream. She didn't run for help. She set the lantern down on the porch rail and walked straight into the storm in her stocking feet. "Mister," she said, kneeling beside him. "Mister, can you hear me?" He groaned. Blood soaked through his shirt at the shoulder dark and spreading, mixing with rainwater into something the color of rust. His hat had come off somewhere in the fall, and Clara could see his face now. Young, maybe 30, maybe younger under all that dirt and pain, with a jaw clenched so tight against the hurt that his whole body shook with the effort of not crying out. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Clara said the way she might talk to a spooked horse. "I ain't gonna hurt you, but I need you to let me look." "Don't," he rasped. "Don't touch it." "I'm touching it," Clara said, and she did, pressing her palm flat against the wound before he could argue further. He hissed through his teeth, his hand shooting up to grip her wrist, not to stop her, she realized, but just to hold on to something. Anything. "What's your name?" she asked. "Don't matter." "It matters to me. I ain't patching up a nameless man in my own front yard." A long pause. Rain hammered the brim of her bonnet, ran in rivers down her collar. Somewhere behind her, she heard voices, the Hendricks boy probably, or Old Man Tuttle, drawn out by the commotion of a horse crashing through town at that hour. "Caleb," the stranger finally said. "Caleb Rusk." "Well, Caleb Rusk," Clara said, "you're going to live because I say so, and I don't take kindly to being made a liar." That was when the deputy arrived, rifle already up, rain sluicing off the barrel. "Clara Whitlow, you get away from that man right now," the deputy said. "That's Caleb Rusk. Wanted out of 3 counties for what he'd done at the Larrabee race 2 years back. Man's a killer." Clara didn't look up. She kept both hands pressed to the wound, kept her weight bearing down steady, the way her mother had taught her to stop bleeding on a hog after slaughter, and she said the words that would follow her through every gossiping mouth in Mercy Ridge for weeks to come. "He's dying," she said. "You want him dead so bad, you shoot through me first." The deputy's rifle wavered. Rain dripped off his hat brim into his eyes. Behind him, more shapes gathered in the dark, the town waking up to catastrophe, the way it always did, slow and hungry for something to talk about come morning. "Ma'am, I ain't gonna shoot you." "Then put that thing down and go fetch Doc Larson," Clara snapped, and something in her voice, something forged in the 2 years since she'd buried a husband and a son in the same week, made the deputy's rifle drop an inch, then 2, then all the way down to his side. "Clara!" came another voice, older, sharper. Harlan Pike stepped out from the gathering crowd, his coat still buttoned proper. Even in the downpour, the kind of man who never once in his life got caught looking anything but composed. "You don't know what that man's done." "I know what he's doing right now," Clara said. "He's bleeding to death in my yard while everybody stands around jawing about it." "He killed a boy," Harlan said. "Tossed him off his horse in a race, crippled him for life, then run off before anybody could hold him to account. That's the kind of man you're protecting." Something flickered across Caleb's face. Not denial, not defense, just a raw and terrible flinch, like the accusation had landed somewhere deeper than the bullet wound. Clara felt it under her palms, felt the way his whole body tightened. "That true?" she asked him quietly. Only to him, the rain and the crowd, and Harlan Pike all fading to something distant and unimportant. Caleb's eyes met hers. Pain-glazed, rain-soaked, and something else underneath, a kind of exhaustion that went bone-deep. The exhaustion of a man who'd been running from himself far longer than he'd been running from any posse. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said so low, only she could hear. "Don't mean it didn't happen." Clara held his gaze a moment longer. Then she looked back up at Harlan Pike and the deputy and the dozen or so townsfolk who'd gathered in the rain to watch a woman decide a man's fate. "Whatever he did or didn't do," Clara said, "it ain't gonna get settled with him bleeding out in my front yard tonight. Somebody fetch the doctor, or somebody help me carry him inside, but somebody do something besides stand there dripping." For a long moment, nobody moved. The rain kept falling. Then, to everyone's surprise, including her own, it was Harlan Pike's own foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Ezra Combs, who stepped forward and knelt to take Caleb's other side. "Reckon the widow's got a point," Ezra muttered, not quite meeting Harlan's eye. "Man's near dead already. Ain't much a rope's gonna add to that tonight." They got him inside. Clara's shop was small. 2 rooms, really the front for her sewing, and mending the back where she slept alone in a bed, too big for one woman. But she cleared her work table of fabric and pins, and had Ezra lay Caleb across it, before the man had even finished protesting that he didn't need charity. "This ain't charity," Clara said, already cutting away his shirt with her sewing shears. Quick practiced motions, despite the tremor in her hands. "This is just what decent people do." "Some folks wouldn't agree I deserve decent," Caleb said through gritted teeth as she probed the wound. "Some folks ain't in this room," Clara said. "Bullet's still in there. I can feel it. You want me to dig it out, or you want to wait for Doc Larson and bleed a little more first?" "Do it," Caleb said. "Do it now." She did. Doc Larson arrived halfway through, breathless and soaked, and took over with steadier hands. But by then, Clara had already stopped the worst of the bleeding, already packed the wound with clean cloth, already done the thing that would make half of Mercy Ridge whisper her name with a curl of the lip for weeks. By the time the doctor finished stitching him closed, the rain had eased to a drizzle, and most of the crowd outside had drifted home, disappointed. There'd be no hanging that night. Harlan Pike lingered longest standing, just inside Clara's doorway, with his arms crossed, watching the whole business with the careful, calculating look of a man filing information away for later use. "You've made yourself a problem, Clara," he said finally. "I've made myself a decision," Clara corrected. "There's a difference. Town's not gonna forget you took in a wanted man. Not gonna forget it easy. Town's got a short memory when it suits them, and a long one when it don't," Clara said, not looking up from where she was cleaning her shears. "I've noticed that about Mercy Ridge before." Harlan's jaw tightened at that. A reference unspoken, but understood to the whispers that had followed Clara since the fever took her husband and boy. Since she'd been left alone, plus-sized and unmarried, in a town that measured a woman's worth by the size of the man standing beside her, and found herself in their eyes wanting. "Just watch yourself," Harlan said, and left without another word, his boots splashing through the last of the puddles outside. Doc Larson packed up his bag, not long after leaving instructions for the wound, and a warning that the stranger shouldn't be moved for at least a week, maybe 2. "You sure about this, Clara?" the doctor asked at the door, glancing back at the man now sleeping fitfully on her work table, covered with the good quilt she kept for company that never came. "Man like that, reputation like that. I'm sure I couldn't watch him die in my yard and sleep easy after," Clara said. "Rest of it I'll figure out as it comes." Alone with him, at last, Clara sat in the chair beside the table and watched the rise and fall of his chest, steadier now, the fever flush starting to fade from his face. She thought about the lantern still burning on her porch rail, the one she lit every night without fail, and wondered if somewhere her husband Thomas was shaking his head at the foolishness of what she'd done. You'd have done the same, she told him silently. You always were soft on strays. Caleb's eyes fluttered open some time past midnight, finding her still sitting there in the dim lamplight. Why? He asked, voice cracked and rough. Why'd you do it? You don't know me. Don't know if what they said is true. I know a dying man when I see one, Clara said. Rest of it can wait till you're strong enough to tell it yourself if you're of a mind to. Might not like what you hear, might not, Clara agreed. But I've heard plenty of things I didn't like from folks who never bled for anybody but themselves. Figure a man who's willing to die quiet rather than beg for his life's got something in him worth hearing out. Caleb studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his exhausted eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the first faint crack in a wall he'd built brick by brick for 2 long years of running. Caleb Rusk, he said again, like he was testing whether the name still belonged to him after everything. Clara Whitlow, she said back. Now hush and rest. Morning comes early around here, and you and I both got a town full of folks to answer to once the sun's up. He didn't argue. His eyes drifted shut, and for the first time since the hoofbeats had woken her out of a fitful sleep, Clara allowed herself to feel the fear underneath her steady hands. Fear of what she'd just done. Fear of what it would cost her. Fear of a town that had never forgiven her for surviving when her family hadn't. But underneath the fear was something else. Something she hadn't let herself feel in 2 long years of empty suppers and a too big bed and a lantern burning for ghosts. She hadn't felt useful in so long. She hadn't felt seen in so long, not by a man who wanted something from her body, or her land, or her late husband's debts, but by someone who simply needed her hands, her strength, her stubborn refusal to let a life slip away on her watch. Morning found her still in the chair, stiff-necked and exhausted when a fist pounded on her shop door hard enough to rattle the glass. Clara Whitlow. Sheriff Boone's voice gruff with sleep and irritation. Open up. We got things to discuss about the man in your keeping. Clara rose slowly, smoothing her skirts, casting one last glance at Caleb, still asleep, still breathing, still alive, because of what she'd done in the rain. She squared her shoulders, the way she'd learned to do every single time this town looked at her and found her wanting, and she walked to the door to face whatever storm was waiting on the other side of it. Whatever came next, she thought at least this time she wouldn't be facing it as the widow who talked to ghosts. She'd be facing it as the woman who'd chosen with her own 2 hands to save a stranger's life. Consequences be damned. She opened the door. Sheriff Boone stood there with 3 other men behind him, faces grim in the pale morning light, and Clara understood before a single word was spoken that the real trouble in Mercy Ridge was only just beginning. We need to talk about Caleb Rusk, Boone said, and about what you think you're doing harboring a wanted man under your roof. He's not under my roof because he's wanted, Clara said, standing her full height in the doorway, blocking it with her body the same way she'd blocked a bullet the night before. He's under my roof because he's healing. There's a difference. Sheriff, same as I told Harlan Pike last night, and I'll keep telling it to anybody who asks until somebody in this town remembers what decency looks like. Boone's eyes flicked past her to the shape of Caleb still lying on the work table, then back to Clara's unflinching face. Folks are talking, he said, saying things about you now. About him. About what it means a widow woman taking a strange man into her home in the dead of night. Let them talk, Clara said. They've been talking about me since the day they buried my husband and son. One more rumor won't kill me. But it might have killed him, if I'd have listened to any of you instead of my own conscience. The sheriff studied her for a long moment. Something almost like respect flickering behind his tired eyes, quickly buried under the weight of duty and politics, and a town that answered one way or another to men like Harlan Pike. I'll need to question him, Boone said finally, soon as he's able. Can't let a wanted man sit healing in the middle of town without answers. When he's able, Clara agreed. Not before. Doc Larson says a week, maybe 2. And I aim to see he gets every day of that healing he needs before anybody puts him through more than his body can bear. And if he ain't innocent, Clara, what then? You gonna stand in front of him then too? Clara didn't answer right away. She thought of the flinch on Caleb's face the night before, the way guilt had sat so heavy and so honest in his eyes when Harlan Pike named his crime out loud. A guilty man protesting his innocence looked different from a guilty man carrying his guilt like a stone he couldn't set down. "I don't know what he is yet," Clara said honestly. "But I know what I am. I'm a woman who couldn't let another person die on her doorstep, whatever he might have done before he got there. Rest of it we'll sort out when the truth's ready to be sorted. Until then, he stays here, he heals, and this town keeps its rifles pointed somewhere else." She shut the door before Boone could argue further, leaning her back against it, her heart hammering hard enough to shake her ribs. Behind her, Caleb's voice, weak but clear, broke the silence. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Didn't have to stand for me twice in one night." Clara turned to find him watching her, propped up slightly against the pillow she'd tucked behind his shoulders, pain and something like wonder mingling in his tired eyes. "Maybe I didn't," Clara admitted. "But I've spent 2 years letting this town decide what I am and what I'm worth. Last night, for the first time in longer than I care to say, I decided something for myself. Turns out it feels a whole lot better than I remembered." "They're gonna make you pay for it," Caleb said. "Man like Pike Sheriff, like Boone bending to his will, they don't let a woman win, not for long." "Let them try," Clara said, and there was iron in her voice now, forged fresh in the fire of the night before. "I buried a husband and a son in the same week, Caleb Rusk, and I'm still standing. I don't reckon there's much left this town can do to me that would hurt worse than that already did." Caleb held her gaze, and something passed between them in that quiet, sunlit room. Not romance, not yet. Not anything either of them could have named out loud. Just two broken people recognizing in each other the particular exhaustion of carrying a weight the whole world insisted on judging from the outside, without ever once asking what it cost to bear. "Have you eaten?" Clara asked suddenly, the question landing soft and strange in the tension-thick air. Caleb blinked. "What? Have you eaten?" Clara repeated, already moving toward her small stove, already reaching for the coffee pot and the last of yesterday's bread. "Man can't heal on an empty stomach, and Lord knows there's precious little either of us can control today, except whether you get some breakfast in you before Boone comes knocking again." A ghost of something crossed Caleb's face. Then not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, the first softening she'd seen in features carved hard by years of running and hiding and surviving alone. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "Reckon I haven't. Not in longer than I care to admit." "Well," Clara said, setting a pan on the stove with hands that had finally stopped shaking, "that's about to change." Outside, the town of Mercy Ridge stirred to life around them, tongues already wagging judgments, already forming the machinery of gossip and cruelty, grinding into motion the way it always did, when something didn't fit the shape they expected it to hold. But inside that small sewing shop, with the smell of coffee starting to fill the air, and a wounded stranger watching a widow move about her kitchen. Like the simple act of feeding someone was the most natural thing in the world. Something had already changed that no amount of talk could undo. Two broken lives had found each other in the rain, and neither one of them not yet understood how far that single simple question, "Have you eaten?" was about to carry them through fire and lies, and a reckoning that would shake Mercy Ridge to its foundations. Ting's substantial word count requirements. Boone's men didn't leave right away. They lingered on the boardwalk outside Clara's shop for the better part of an hour, boots scuffing the wet planks, voices pitched low but not low enough that Clara couldn't hear fragments drifting through her window while she fed Caleb spoonfuls of broth he was too weak to manage on his own. "Ain't right a woman doing that. Pike's gonna want somebody to answer for it. Heard she talks to her dead husband out on that porch." Clara's jaw tightened with every word, but her hand stayed steady, the spoon never wavering as she brought it to Caleb's lips. "They're always going to talk," Caleb said quietly, watching her face instead of the broth. "You don't have to pretend you can't hear them." "I hear plenty," Clara said. "Learned a long time ago that hearing something and letting it matter are two different things. Now eat. Doc Larson said you need your strength, and gossip never filled a man's belly." Caleb obeyed mostly because arguing took more energy than he had, and because there was something in the set of Clara's shoulders that told him this was a fight he wasn't going to win. He studied her instead, the crease of concentration between her brows, the way strands of dark hair had escaped her braid overnight and hung loose against her cheek. She looked exhausted. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept properly in longer than one bad night could account for. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you, seeing as you were near dying." "That's different." "Is it?" Clara set the bowl down, wiped her hands on her apron. "I watched a man bleed out on my work table last night, Caleb Rusk. Pardon me if sleep didn't come easy after that." He fell quiet at that guilt flickering across his face, not just for the trouble he'd brought to her door, but for something older, something that lived behind his eyes like a splinter that had worked its way in too deep to dig out. Clara noticed it. She noticed most things had learned to in the 2 years since grief had sharpened her into someone who watched people the way other folks watched weather, looking for the signs of a coming storm. "You gonna tell me what happened?" she asked. "At that race, the one Pike was so quick to throw in your face." Caleb's throat worked. For a long moment, Clara thought he wouldn't answer at all, that the wall he'd built would hold fast against her question the same way it had probably held against every question anyone had asked him for 2 long years of running. "Not today," he said finally, voice raw. "Please, Clara, not today." She studied him, weighing the plea in his voice against her own need to know exactly what kind of man she'd dragged in out of the storm. But there was something in his eyes. Not evasion, not the slippery look of a man hiding a lie, but genuine pain, old and unhealed, that made her nod slowly instead of pressing. "Not today, then," she agreed. "But someday, Caleb. If you're going to stay under my roof, healing on my dime, eating my bread someday, you owe me the truth of it." "I know," he said. "I know I do." The morning wore on. Clara busied herself with the small tasks of running a shop that couldn't afford to close its doors even for a crisis. Mending a torn coat for the blacksmith's wife, hemming a dress for the schoolteacher. All while keeping one ear tuned to the sound of Caleb's breathing across the room, listening for any change, any worsening, any sign that the fever Doc Larson had warned about might be creeping back. It was near noon when the bell above her shop door jingled, and Clara looked up to see Martha Coyle standing in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, disapproval carved into every line of her face. "Clara Whitlow," Martha said, not bothering with a greeting. "Is it true you've got that outlaw in here laid up in your own shop?" "His name's Caleb Rusk," Clara said evenly, not looking up from her sewing. "And he's not an outlaw, Martha. He's a man who needed help same as anyone would." "Same as anyone." Martha's voice climbed an octave. "Clara, the man's wanted for crippling a boy, for running off and leaving that family to pick up the pieces of what he did. And you've got him sleeping not 20 feet from where decent women bring their mending." Clara's needle stilled. She set down her sewing, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at Martha Coyle with the particular calm she'd learned to summon whenever the town decided her business was theirs to judge. "Martha," she said, "when Thomas passed, and then my boy not 4 days later, do you recall what this town did for me?" Martha's face flickered, uncertain now, thrown by the sudden turn. "You brought a casserole," Clara continued. "One casserole and a lot of pitying looks, and then you all went right back to your lives while I sat in an empty house wondering how I was supposed to keep breathing. Nobody asked if I'd eaten. Nobody sat with me through the nights I couldn't sleep for grief. I learned real quick that this town's kindness runs about as deep as a puddle in August." "That's not fair, Clara." "Maybe not," Clara agreed. "But it's true. And when I found a man dying in my yard last night, I made a choice this town never made for me. I chose to help. Whatever he's done, whatever he hasn't, that choice is mine to make, same as it was mine to make when I decided not to lie down and die of grief myself." Martha stood there for a long moment, mouth working like she wanted to argue further. But something in Clara's steady gaze seemed to still her tongue. Finally, she turned on her heel and left without another word. The bell jangling sharp behind her, and Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. From across the room, Caleb's voice weak but warm, with something like admiration. "You didn't have to say all that." "No," Clara agreed. But it felt good to finally say it out loud. That afternoon brought more visitors, some curious, some hostile. A few, even kind old Mrs. Ferris, brought a loaf of bread and didn't ask a single question, just set it on the counter and patted Clara's hand before shuffling back out into the street. But it was clear by sundown that the whole of Mercy Ridge had already made up its mind about what Clara Whitlow's choice meant, and none of the verdicts being whispered on porches and in the general store were kind. The real trouble came 3 days later, when Caleb was strong enough to sit up unassisted, strong enough to feed himself, strong enough against Clara's protests to insist on standing at the window and watching the street outside instead of resting like the doctor ordered. "You're gonna tear those stitches," Clara warned, coming up behind him with a fresh cup of coffee she set on the sill. "Been laying flat on my back for 3 days, Caleb said. "Man goes soft in the head doing nothing but staring at the ceiling. Better soft in the head than bleeding out again." Caleb almost smiled at that, the first real almost smile she'd seen from him, small and fleeting, but genuine. Then his eyes caught something out in the street, and the almost smile died as fast as it had come. "That the man Boone answers to?" he asked, nodding toward a figure crossing the muddy road, coat buttoned, proper hat set at a careful angle. Harlan Pike, walking with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned more of Mercy Ridge than anyone cared to admit out loud. "That's Harlan Pike." Clara confirmed, something hard creeping into her voice. "Owns the cattle exchange, half the mortgages in town, and most of the men fool enough to think his friendship's worth having. He's coming this way." Clara's stomach tightened. Sure enough, Harlan crossed the street with deliberate purpose, mounting the boardwalk steps outside her shop and pausing at the door long enough to knock once, a formality, since he pushed the door open before Clara could even cross the room to answer it. "Clara," Harlan said, removing his hat with exaggerated politeness. His eyes flicked past her to Caleb standing at the window, and something calculating sharpened in his gaze. "Mr. Rusk, glad to see you're recovering." "Can't say the feeling's mutual given the circumstances," Caleb said flatly. Harlan's smile didn't waver. Direct. "I appreciate that in a man." He turned back to Clara. "I've come about your land, Clara. The parcel bordering my east pasture." Clara's spine stiffened. "What about it?" "There's some question about the boundary lines. The old survey from your husband's time doesn't quite match the county records I've had drawn up. I'd hate for there to be any confusion about where your property ends and mine begins." "There's no confusion," Clara said, keeping her voice steady despite the cold dread pooling in her stomach. "Thomas had that land surveyed proper when we bought it. Filed the papers with the county clerk myself." "Papers can be misplaced," Harlan said mildly. "Records lost. It happens more often than you'd think, especially in a county as poorly managed as ours. I'd hate for a widow alone with no husband to advocate for her interests to find herself on the wrong side of a boundary dispute." The threat sat in the room like a physical thing, unmistakable, despite the pleasant tone in which it was delivered. Clara felt Caleb straighten behind her, felt the sudden tension radiating off him even in his weakened state. "Is that a threat, Mr. Pike?" Caleb asked, voice low and dangerous in a way Clara hadn't heard from him before. Harlan's eyes swung to Caleb, cool and unbothered. "Just a friendly warning, Mr. Rusk, between neighbors. Though I do wonder," he paused, letting the silence stretch, "whether a wanted man is really the wisest choice of protector for a woman in Clara's position. Seems to me you'd be more liability than shield, should things turn complicated." "Get out," Clara said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Harlan's eyebrows rose. "Clara, I said get out, Harlan Pike. You've delivered your message. There's no need for you to linger and admire your handiwork." For a moment, something flashed across Harlan's face, irritation maybe, or the particular anger of a man unused to being denied anything. But he mastered it quickly, settling his hat back on his head with unhurried precision. "I'll be back to discuss the survey," he said. "Perhaps when you're feeling less emotional about the matter." The door clicked shut behind him. Clara stood frozen for a long moment, her hands trembling with a fury she'd been holding back since the moment he walked in. "He's after your land," Caleb said quietly. He's been sniffing around it since Thomas died. Clara admitted, sinking into her chair, suddenly exhausted. Made me an offer to buy it outright not 6 months after the funeral. When I refused, he started in with talk about surveys and boundaries. I thought he'd given up. Men like that don't give up, Caleb said. They just wait for a weak moment, figure a widow alone might finally be desperate enough to sell. Clara looked up at him. And now, there's a wanted man living under her roof, giving him one more reason to paint her as unfit. Caleb's jaw tightened. I should go. Soon as I'm able. I'm making things worse for you staying here. No, Clara said, surprising herself with the force of her own conviction. No, you're not going anywhere until you're properly healed. I didn't drag you out of that mud to hand you back to whatever's hunting you, the second things get difficult. Clara, I mean it, Caleb. She stood crossing to stand before him, close enough now that he had to look down slightly to meet her eyes. Harlan Pike's been circling my land for 2 years. He'll find some excuse to come after it whether you're here or not. I won't let him think he's won by scaring you off. Caleb studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper he didn't yet have words for. You're a stubborn woman, Clara Whitlow, he said finally. I've been called worse. Clara said, usually by men who couldn't stand a woman who wouldn't fold. That night, after the shop had gone dark, and Caleb had drifted into a fitful sleep on the small cot Clara had made up for him in the back room, Clara sat alone at her kitchen table, with Thomas's old ledger book spread before her, searching desperately for the original survey documents Harlan had claimed might be lost. She found them, an hour later, tucked into the back pages of Thomas's account book. The ink faded but legible, the boundary lines drawn clear and unmistakable. Relief flooded through her quickly, followed by a fresh wave of dread, because if Harlan was willing to claim these records didn't exist, willing to manufacture confusion where none should exist, what else might he be willing to fabricate? The answer came 4 days later in a form none of them expected. Clara was in the shop fitting a dress for the banker's wife when the door burst open hard enough to rattle the window glass. Sheriff Boone stood there, face grim, 2 deputies flanking him, all 3 men with hands resting a little too casually near their holsters. Clara Whitlow, Boone said, voice heavy with something like regret. I need you to step aside. What's this about, Sheriff? Clara asked, though dread was already coiling tight in her stomach. Got a complaint, Boone said. Serious one. Says Caleb Rusk's been seen skulking around the Hendricks property at night, and there's talk he might have been the one responsible for the fire that took their barn last week. Clara's blood went cold. That's a lie. Caleb hasn't left this shop in 2 weeks, Sheriff, and you know it. Half this town's watched him through my window, laid up healing from a bullet wound he took saving nobody but himself the trouble of dying in a ditch. I got a witness says otherwise, Boone said, not quite meeting her eyes. Who? Caleb's voice came from the back room, and he appeared in the doorway a moment later, moving stiffly, but standing on his own. Some color finally returned to his face. Who says they saw me? Because I ain't left this room except to use the outhouse, and Clara can vouch for every hour of every day. Ezra Combs, Boone said, and something in his tone suggested he didn't fully believe his own words. Says he saw a man matching your description near the Hendricks barn the night it burned. Ezra Combs works for Harlan Pike, Clara said, fury rising hot in her chest. This is Harlan's doing. He's trying to build a case, trying to make Caleb out to be dangerous so he can push me off my land without a fight. That's a mighty big accusation, Clara, Boone said. It's a mighty convenient witness, Clara shot back. Ezra Combs wouldn't wipe his own boots without Harlan's say-so, and you know that better than anyone in this town. Boone's jaw worked torn between duty and the obvious truth sitting plain on Clara's face. But before he could respond, one of the deputies stepped forward, hand moving toward the cuffs at his belt. Sheriff, we got orders to bring him in for questioning. He's not going anywhere, Clara said, stepping between Caleb and the approaching deputy with a fierceness that surprised even herself. Not until you bring me real evidence, not gossip dressed up as testimony from a man who'd say the sky was green if Harlan Pike told him to. Clara, Boone said, warning in his voice. "You're obstructing." "I'm protecting an innocent man from a false accusation," Clara said. "There's a difference, Sheriff, same as I told you the first night this started." The standoff stretched tense and dangerous until Caleb's voice cut through the silence, calm, steady, resigned, in a way that made Clara's heart ache. "Let them take me, Clara." "Caleb, no. I've been running from things a long time," he said, meeting her eyes with a clarity that hadn't been there before. "Maybe it's time I stopped running and started answering for what folks want to accuse me of, true or not. Better that than let Boone haul me out in chains in front of the whole town, and worse, better than let Harlan Pike use this as another excuse to come after you." "You didn't do this," Clara said fiercely. "You were here. I know you were here." "I know it too," Caleb said. "But knowing and proving are two different animals, same as you told me yourself. Let me go answer their questions, Clara. Standing here fighting Boone's deputies ain't gonna help either of us." Clara wanted to argue further, wanted to plant herself immovably between Caleb and the men come to take him. But something in his steady gaze stopped her. This wasn't surrender, she realized. This was a man choosing deliberately to face his accusers head-on, instead of hiding the opposite in every way of the drifter who'd collapsed in her yard 2 weeks ago, running from a past he couldn't outrun forever. "I'll come with you," Clara said, turning to Boone. "To the jailhouse. I want to hear every word of this questioning." "Clara, that ain't proper." "Neither is arresting an innocent man on the word of Harlan Pike's lapdog," Clara snapped. "You'll let me come, Sheriff Boone, or I'll be writing a very detailed letter to the territorial marshal about how justice gets conducted in Mercy Ridge." Boone's face went through several expressions before settling on weary resignation. "Fine, but you wait outside the questioning room." The walk to the jailhouse felt like the longest of Clara's life, the whole town seeming to turn out to watch, whispers trailing them like smoke. Clara kept her chin high, refusing to let a single flicker of doubt show on her face, though inside her stomach churned with fear for what might happen to Caleb once he was locked behind those bars. The questioning lasted 2 hours. Clara paced the small waiting area the entire time, catching fragments of raised voices through the thin walls, unable to make out words, but recognizing the rhythm of accusation and denial, back and forth, relentless. When Boone finally emerged, his face was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Well?" Clara demanded. "We're holding him," Boone said. "Not enough to charge him outright, but enough concern that I want him where I can keep an eye on things until we sort out what's true." "That's not justice, Sheriff. That's convenience." "Maybe." Boone admitted something almost apologetic in his weathered face. "But it's the best I can do right now, Clara, with Pike breathing down my neck, and half the town scared of what a man with Rusk's reputation might do if he's running loose." Clara's fists clenched at her sides. "I want to see him." 5 minutes. Boone relented. "That's all I can give you." The jail cell was small, cold. Nothing like the warm kitchen where Clara had fed Caleb broth just days before. He sat on the narrow cot, elbows on his knees, head bowed, looking more defeated than she'd seen him even bleeding out in her front yard. "Caleb," she said softly. He looked up, and something in his eyes cracked at the sight of her. "You shouldn't have come." "Like hell I shouldn't have." Clara gripped the bars, leaning close. "This is Harlan's doing, Caleb. I know it in my bones. He's building a case against you to weaken me, to make it look like I harbored a dangerous man, all so he can push through his land grab without anyone questioning his methods." "Maybe," Caleb said wearily. "Or maybe this is just what happens to men like me. Maybe I've spent so long running from the past that it finally caught up one way or another, and it don't much matter whether the fire was really my doing or not." "Don't you dare give up," Clara said, fierce enough that Caleb's head snapped up in surprise. "Don't you dare sit there and accept a lie just because you're carrying guilt over something else entirely. Whatever happened at that horse race, whatever guilt you're nursing over at this fire isn't that. You didn't do this, and I won't let this town pretend otherwise just because it's convenient for a man like Harlan Pike." Caleb stared at her, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. "Why do you care so much, Clara? You barely know me. 2 weeks ago, you didn't even know my name. Because..." Clara said, her voice softening even as her grip on the bars tightened. Because I know what it feels like to have this town decide who you are without ever asking the truth of it. I know what it feels like to be judged, condemned, whispered about by people who've never once bothered to sit across a table and simply ask if you've eaten, if you're hurting, if there's anything true beneath the rumors they'd rather believe. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, warm and grateful, and a little bit broken. "Have you eaten?" he asked quietly, echoing her own words back to her. Clara let out a startled, watery laugh despite the fear still gripping her chest. "Not since this morning, if you must know." "Then go eat something," Caleb said. "No sense in both of us starving while I sit here waiting on Boone to sort through Harlan's lies." "Caleb, I'll be all right, Clara," he said, though the words carried more hope than certainty. "You've done more for me already than anyone's done in longer than I care to remember. Whatever happens next, I won't forget that." Boone's voice called from the front room, signaling that the 5 minutes were up. Clara held Caleb's gaze a moment longer, memorizing the exhausted determination in his eyes, before forcing herself to step back from the bars. "I'm not giving up on proving this," she said. "Whatever it takes." She left the jailhouse with fire in her chest and fear coiling cold in her stomach, marching straight toward the one place she knew might hold answers. The Hendricks property, where the barn had burned, where the truth of what really happened that night might still be waiting to be uncovered by anyone willing to look past Harlan Pike's convenient narrative. The Hendricks barn was a blackened skeleton by the time Clara arrived, still smoldering faintly at the edges, despite the days since the fire, the acrid smell of char hanging heavy in the afternoon air. Old man Hendricks himself was picking through the wreckage when Clara approached his weathered face, heavy with exhaustion and loss. "Mr. Hendricks," Clara called. "Might I have a word?" He looked up, surprise flickering across his features. "Widow Whitlow, didn't expect to see you out this way." "I need to ask you about the fire," Clara said, coming to stand beside him amid the ruins. "About what you actually saw that night." Hendricks's expression shuddered, slightly wary. "Sheriff already got my statement." "I'm not asking for the sheriff," Clara said. "I'm asking for the truth, Mr. Hendricks. Man to man or woman to man, whatever you please. Did you actually see Caleb Rusk near this barn the night it burned?" Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting back to the charred remains of his livelihood. "Didn't see nobody," he admitted finally, voice low. "Was asleep when it started. First I knew of it was the smell of smoke, and my wife screaming to get the animals out. Then how did Ezra Combs come to claim he saw Caleb here that night?" "Combs told the sheriff he was passing through on Pike's business," Hendricks said. "Said he saw a stranger lurking near the barn not an hour before the fire started." "And you believe that?" Hendricks's jaw tightened. "Don't know what to believe anymore, Clara. All I know is my barn's gone, 3 of my best horses barely made it out alive, and somebody's got to answer for it." "Somebody should," Clara agreed. "But it should be whoever's actually responsible, not whoever's most convenient to blame." She left the Hendricks property with more questions than answers. But one thing had crystallized in her mind with absolute certainty: Ezra Combs was lying, or at the very least conveniently mistaken, in exactly the way that served his employer's interests. The question now was how to prove it, how to unravel a lie carefully constructed by a man with enough money and influence to make the truth nearly impossible to reach. She found the answer 3 days later in the most unexpected of places. Clara had returned to her shop exhausted and heartsick, after another fruitless day of trying to gather evidence, when a soft knock came at her back door. Not the front where customers and townsfolk entered, but the back where only those seeking discretion would think to approach. She opened it to find a young woman she recognized vaguely from the Pike Ranch, one of the household servants, her face pale and nervous, glancing over her shoulder as though fearful of being followed. "Mrs. Whitlow," the girl whispered. "I need to speak with you. About Ezra Combs. About what really happened at the Hendricks barn." Clara's heart leaped. "Come in, quickly." The girl slipped inside, wringing her hands anxiously as Clara shut the door behind her. "My name's Josie. I work in the Pike kitchen. I shouldn't be here, Mrs. Whitlow. If Mr. Pike knew—" He won't know, Clara said gently. Whatever you tell me stays between us, unless you're willing to say it to the sheriff yourself. Josie's eyes widened with fear. I can't do that. I'd lose my position, maybe worse, but I couldn't stay quiet, not when I heard Ezra bragging to the other hands about how he'd fixed things nice for Mr. Pike with his statement to the sheriff. Clara's pulse quickened. What exactly did he say? He said... Josie's voice dropped even lower, barely audible. He said Mr. Pike paid him good money to say he saw a stranger near the Hendricks barn. Said the fire wasn't even an accident at all. Said Mr. Pike had it set himself to stir up trouble to make folks scared enough of drifters and strangers that they'd support him running Mr. Rusk out of town. And once Rusk was gone, once you were alone and vulnerable again, Mr. Pike figured you'd finally sell him that land you've been refusing to part with. The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, the full scope of Harlan Pike's manipulation crashing over her, all at once the fire. The false accusation, the calculated cruelty of using an innocent family's tragedy as a pawn in his scheme to steal her land. Will you tell the sheriff this? Clara asked, though she already suspected the answer. Josie shook her head frantically. I can't, Mrs. Whitlow. Please don't ask that of me. Mr. Pike would ruin me, ruin my whole family. I only came because my conscience couldn't bear it knowing an innocent man might hang for something Mr. Pike arranged himself. I understand, Clara said, though frustration burned hot beneath her calm exterior. Thank you, Josie, for your courage in coming here at all. After the girl slipped back out into the gathering dusk, Clara sat alone in her darkening shop, mind racing. She had the truth now, or close enough to it, but truth without proof was worthless in a town where Harlan Pike controlled the sheriff's patience and the jury's sympathies alike. She needed evidence, something concrete, something that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or a scorned servant's gossip. The answer came to her slowly forming out of desperation and the stubborn refusal to let Caleb Rusk hang for a crime Harlan Pike himself had orchestrated. If Ezra Combs had been paid for his false testimony, there would be a record somewhere, a ledger entry, a bank transaction, something Harlan's meticulous nature would have insisted on documenting even in the midst of his corruption. Clara knew with dawning certainty exactly where to look. The following morning, she presented herself at the county clerk's office, requesting access to the public land records, the same records Harlan had claimed were confused or missing regarding her property boundary. If he'd tampered with those records, there would be evidence of the alteration, some trace of the original survey Thomas had filed years before. The clerk, a nervous young man named Wilbur Sneed, seemed reluctant to produce the records, at first glancing anxiously toward the door, as though expecting Harlan Pike to materialize at any moment. I'm not sure those files are available for public review at the moment, Mrs. Whitlow, Wilbur stammered. They're public records, Mr. Sneed, Clara said firmly, filed with this county, available to any citizen who requests them, unless you're telling me something's happened to make them unavailable. Wilbur's face went pale. It's just, Mr. Pike said, Mr. Pike doesn't own this office, Clara interrupted. Last I checked, you work for the county, not for Harlan Pike's personal interests. Now, are you going to produce those records, or do I need to write directly to the territorial governor about obstruction of public documents? The threat, empty as it might have been, was enough to make Wilbur scramble for the files. What Clara found within them made her blood run cold with vindication. The original survey, Thomas's careful signature, still visible at the bottom, clearly showing the boundary line, exactly where Clara had always known it to be. But more damning still was a second document tucked behind the first, dated only weeks earlier, a hastily drafted amendment, purporting to redraw the boundary in Harlan Pike's favor, bearing a signature that was unmistakably clumsily forged to resemble Thomas Whitlow's hand. This is forged, Clara breathed, staring at the fraudulent document. Thomas has been dead 2 years. He couldn't have signed anything weeks ago. Wilbur's face had gone from pale to positively ashen. Mrs. Whitlow, I swear I didn't know. Who filed this? Clara demanded, holding up the forged amendment. I don't recall exactly. There's been so much paperwork. Think, Mr. Sneed, This is fraud, and if you're complicit in it, you'll answer for it, same as whoever created this document." Wilbur's hands trembled as he flipped through his filing log, finally landing on an entry that made his breath catch. It was filed by proxy. Ezra Combs brought it in, said he was acting on behalf of the estate. There it was, the connection undeniable, now linking Harlan Pike's land grab directly to forged documents and fraudulent claims. Combined with what Josie had revealed about the fire, about the payment for false testimony, Clara finally had the beginnings of a case that might actually unravel the web of lies threatening to destroy both her land and Caleb's freedom. She left the clerk's office with the original survey clutched tight in her hands, evidence of forgery burning hot in her mind, and a fierce, unshakable resolve settling deep in her chest. Harlan Pike had made the mistake of underestimating her, assuming that grief and gender, and the town's judgment, would leave her too weak, too isolated, too broken to fight back. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he'd been. But even as triumph flickered through her, a darker thought intruded. If Harlan was willing to forge documents and pay for false testimony, willing to burn down an innocent family's barn just to manufacture a crisis, what else might he be willing to do to protect his scheme once he realized Clara was closing in on the truth? She quickened her pace toward the jailhouse, suddenly desperate to see Caleb, to warn him to share what she'd uncovered, only to find upon arriving Sheriff Boone standing outside with a face carved from stone and news that stopped her dead in her tracks. "Clara," he said, voice heavy, "there's been a development. Somebody tried to break Rusk out of his cell last night. Nearly succeeded too before my deputy caught wind of it and stopped them." Clara's stomach dropped. "Is Caleb all right?" "He's fine," Boone said. "But whoever tried this wasn't playing games. Left a knife buried in the wall not 2 feet from where he sleeps like a warning." "A warning from who?" Boone's eyes met hers, grim and knowing. "That's what I aim to find out. But I got a suspicion Clara and I reckon you might share it." Clara's mind raced back to everything she'd just uncovered, the forged documents, the paid testimony, the burned barn. If Harlan Pike was willing to go this far to secure his scheme, an attempted jailbreak gone wrong, disguised as an escape attempt that could justify harsher treatment or even a hasty execution of frontier justice, was well within the realm of his ruthlessness. "I need to see him," Clara said. "Now." Boone hesitated only a moment before nodding, leading her back to the cells where Caleb sat pale and shaken, but otherwise unharmed, staring at the knife mark still visible in the wooden wall beside his cot. "Caleb." Clara's voice cracked with barely controlled fear. He looked up, and something in his face eased slightly at the sight of her. "I'm all right, Clara. Whoever it was, they didn't get far before Boone's deputy scared them off." "This was Harlan," Clara said, fiercely gripping the bars. "I know it in my bones, and now I have proof of other things he's done, Caleb. Forged documents, paid testimony. He set that fire himself to frame you and scare this town into supporting whatever scheme he's cooking up against my land." Caleb's eyes widened. "You found proof." "I did," Clara said. "And I'm going to use it whatever it takes to see you cleared, and Harlan Pike finally held accountable for everything he's done to this town." "Clara, if you go after a man like Pike directly, you're putting yourself in real danger. If he's willing to burn a family's barn, willing to send someone to silence me in my own cell, then he's already shown exactly what kind of man he is," Clara interrupted, "and exactly why he needs to be stopped before he hurts anyone else. I'm not backing down now, Caleb. Not when the truth's finally within reach." Caleb studied her for a long moment, fear and fierce pride warring in his tired eyes. "Then let me help. Whatever's coming, I want to face it standing beside you, not locked up behind bars while you fight this alone." "You're still recovering." "I'm strong enough," Caleb said firmly. "Strong enough to stand up for what's right, same as you've been doing since the night I collapsed in your yard. Get me out of here, Clara, and let's finish what Harlan Pike started." Clara held his gaze, feeling something shift between them, not just gratitude anymore. Not just the tentative trust that had grown over 2 weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations, but something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to the beginnings of hope she hadn't dared to feel in over 2 years. "I'll talk to Boone," she said. "Show him what I found, If the evidence is strong enough, maybe I can convince him to release you while the real investigation into Pike moves forward." She turned to find Boone still standing nearby, having clearly overheard enough of the conversation to look deeply troubled. "Sheriff," Clara said, holding up the documents she'd retrieved from the county clerk, "I need you to look at this. All of it. Because I believe Harlan Pike has been systematically destroying this town's trust in justice for his own personal gain. And I have proof." Boone took the documents with visibly reluctant hands, his eyes scanning the forged survey, the discrepancy in signatures, the timeline that made clear something deeply wrong had occurred. "This is—" he trailed off, jaw tightening as the full implications settled over him. "Forgery," Clara finished. "Fraud. And I have a witness, though she's too frightened to speak publicly, who can attest that Ezra Combs was paid to give false testimony about seeing Caleb near the Hendricks barn the night it burned. I believe Harlan Pike set that fire himself. Sheriff, to manufacture exactly this situation, a wanted man to blame a frightened town willing to support driving him out, and a widow left vulnerable enough that she might finally sell land he's been coveting for years." Boone was silent for a long moment, the weight of the accusation settling heavy in the small jailhouse. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a grim resolve Clara hadn't heard from him before. "If this is true," he said slowly, "if Harlan Pike really did all this, it's bigger than just Rusk's guilt or innocence. It's fraud against the county. It's arson. It's attempted murder if last night's business with the knife was his doing too. It's everything I've just said," Clara confirmed. "And I intend to see justice done, Sheriff, one way or another. The only question is whether you're willing to stand with me or whether Harlan Pike's influence runs too deep even for the law to touch." Boone's eyes hardened, some old buried integrity finally surfacing beneath years of political caution. "I took an oath, Clara, sworn to uphold the law, not to protect whoever happens to hold the most money in this county. Give me a day to verify what you've shown me quietly without tipping our hand to Pike. If it holds up—" "It will," Clara said. "Then we'll move against him properly. Real evidence, real charges, not just accusations that'll get dismissed as a widow's grudge. And Caleb." Boone glanced toward the cell, something almost apologetic in his weathered face. "He stays here another night for his own protection more than anything else. If Pike really did send someone to silence him better, he stays where deputies can watch the door than out in the open where Pike's men might try again." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist Caleb be released immediately, but the sense in Boone's caution was undeniable. Better one more uncomfortable night behind bars than risk Caleb's life to Harlan Pike's growing desperation. "One more night," she agreed reluctantly. "But I want extra men watching that cell, Sheriff. I won't have him harmed on your watch after everything else." "Agreed," Boone said. Clara left the jailhouse that evening with a fragile hope kindling in her chest, the first real hope she'd felt since Harlan Pike had first darkened her doorway with his threats about boundary surveys and forgotten records. The truth was finally emerging from the shadows, and for the first time in longer than she cared to admit. Clara Whitlow truly believed, that justice might actually be within reach. But hope she'd learned it over 2 hard years of grief and struggle was a fragile thing easily shattered by circumstances beyond anyone's control. And Harlan Pike, cornered and desperate, was far from finished fighting to protect the empire of lies he'd built. The knock came at Clara's door well past midnight, hard and urgent, the kind of knock that meant trouble before a single word was spoken. She opened it to find Boone's youngest deputy, breathless and pale, hat clutched anxiously in his trembling hands. "Mrs. Whitlow," he gasped. "You need to come quick. It's the jailhouse. It's on fire." Clara didn't remember grabbing her shawl. She didn't remember the run through the dark, muddy street, her lungs burning, her heart hammering a single word over and over. "Caleb, Caleb, Caleb," until she rounded the corner and saw the orange glow lighting up the night sky where the jailhouse stood. Flames licked up the side wall. Black smoke pouring from a window, and a cluster of men were already working a bucket line from the horse trough, their efforts looking hopelessly small against the growing blaze. "Caleb!" Clara screamed, shoving past the gathered crowd. "Where's Caleb Rusk?" Boone appeared out of the smoke, coughing, his face streaked black with soot. "We got him out. He's all right, Clara. He's—" She didn't wait to hear the rest. She pushed past him, scanning the chaos, until she found Caleb sitting on the ground, a safe distance from the flames, a deputy's coat thrown over his shoulders, coughing, but breathing alive. "Caleb." Clara dropped to her knees in the mud beside him, hands framing his soot-streaked face, checking him over with a frantic thoroughness that left no room for modesty or hesitation. "Are you hurt? Tell me you're not hurt." "I'm fine." He rasped, his voice raw from smoke. "Deputy got the cell open just in time. Fire started fast, Clara. Too fast. Started right outside my cell wall like somebody poured coal oil and set a match to it." Clara's blood ran cold. "Somebody tried to kill you. Again. Somebody tried to make sure I never testified against whoever's really responsible for the Hendricks fire," Caleb corrected grimly. "Dead men don't talk, Clara. And dead men definitely don't stand up in front of a judge to say who really burned that barn." Around them, the bucket line continued its desperate work. But it was clear already that the jailhouse Mercy Ridge's only cell, its only place to hold a dangerous man securely, was going to burn to the ground, regardless of anyone's efforts. Wood crackled and popped, embers rising into the night sky like malevolent fireflies, and somewhere in the crowd Clara heard a voice she recognized with a jolt of fresh fury. "Terrible business." Harlan Pike said, his voice carrying easy and smooth over the chaos, as though he were commenting on nothing more significant than the weather. "Though I suppose it solves one problem, doesn't it? No jail, no need to worry about housing a dangerous man in this town any longer." Clara's head snapped up, fury blazing hot enough to rival the flames still consuming the jailhouse behind her. "You did this!" Harlan's eyebrows rose in perfectly practiced surprise. "Clara, I understand you're distraught, but that's a serious accusation to make without evidence." "I have evidence," Clara said, rising to her feet, stepping toward him with a fearlessness that made several bystanders draw back nervously. "Forged documents, paid testimony, and now an attempted murder disguised as a jailhouse fire. You're not as clever as you think, Harlan Pike." Something flickered behind Harlan's composed mask. Not fear exactly, but calculation, the look of a man rapidly recalculating his odds. "I don't know what wild stories you've concocted, Clara, but I'd be careful about the accusations you make in public. Slander carries its own consequences. So does arson." Boone's voice cut in, the sheriff stepping up beside Clara, his soot-streaked face set in hard lines. "So does forgery. So does paying a man to lie under oath. I've seen the documents, Harlan. County clerks already confirmed the timeline. You're going to have a great deal of explaining to do come morning." For the first time since Clara had known him, something like genuine alarm cracked through Harlan Pike's composed exterior. "Boone, you can't seriously believe—" "I believe evidence," Boone said flatly. "And right now the evidence points squarely at you. I'd suggest you go home and think real carefully about how you want to handle what's coming. Because come morning, I'm bringing in the territorial marshal to look at everything Clara's uncovered." Harlan's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking between Boone's unyielding face and Clara's fierce, unflinching stare. Finally, without another word, he turned and stalked off into the darkness, his composed stride betraying nothing. But Clara noticed the tension in his shoulders, the barely contained fury in the set of his spine. "He's not done," Caleb said quietly, watching Harlan disappear into the night. "Man like that, cornered like that, he's more dangerous now than he's ever been." "I know," Clara said, "but we have him, Caleb. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, we actually have him." The fire burned through the rest of the night, reducing Mercy Ridge's small jailhouse to smoldering ash by dawn. With no cell left to hold him, and with the mounting evidence against Harlan Pike shifting the entire narrative of who posed a danger to the town, Boone made the decision to release Caleb into Clara's custody on the condition that he remain available for questioning as the investigation proceeded. "You understand," Boone said gravely as Clara helped Caleb back to her shop in the gray light of early morning. "This doesn't mean you're cleared, Rusk. Not yet. Not until we sort out everything with Pike and confirm your alibi beyond doubt." "I understand," Caleb said. But thank you, Sheriff, for finally looking past the reputation and looking at the truth instead. Boone nodded, something almost like respect passing between the two men. Don't make me regret it. Back at Clara's shop, exhaustion finally caught up with both of them. Caleb collapsed onto his cot the moment they arrived, smoke and soot still clinging to his clothes, his breathing ragged from the strain of the night's chaos. Clara busied herself heating water for tea, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, adrenaline finally draining away and leaving raw fear in its wake. "You could have died tonight," she said, her voice cracking as she set 2 cups on the table. "If that deputy hadn't gotten to you in time." "But he did," Caleb said, gently, reaching out to still her trembling hands with his own. "I'm here, Clara, thanks to you. Thanks to everything you've done fighting for a stranger's life, like he mattered as much as your own." Clara looked up, meeting his eyes, and something passed between them in that quiet moment. Something that had been building slowly over 2 weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations, and mutual defiance against a town determined to see them both destroyed. "You do matter," she said softly. "More than I expected when I found you bleeding in my yard. I didn't know then that I'd come to care so much what happened to you." Caleb's hand tightened gently around hers. "I didn't expect to find anyone who'd fight for me the way you have, Clara. Didn't think there was anyone left in this world who'd choose to stand beside me instead of judging me from a distance." The moment stretched fragile and charged until the sound of hesitant knocking at the shop door broke the spell. Clara startled quickly, withdrawing her hand, though the warmth of the moment lingered even as she moved to answer the door. It was Josie, the young servant girl from Harlan Pike's household, her face pale with terror, glancing anxiously over her shoulder as though pursued. "Mrs. Whitlow," she gasped, slipping inside the moment Clara opened the door. "You have to help. Mr. Pike, he knows someone told you about the fire, about Ezra's false testimony. He's furious, and I think—" She swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes. "I think he means to leave town before the marshal arrives, but not before he settles accounts with everyone who's crossed him." Clara's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, settles accounts? He's been drinking since midnight," Josie said, voice shaking. "Ranting about how you and Mr. Rusk have ruined everything he's worked for. Ezra's been sent to gather the other hands, and I heard Mr. Pike say something about making sure there's nobody left to testify against him." The implication hung heavy and terrifying in the air. Caleb was on his feet instantly, despite his exhaustion, moving toward Clara with fierce protective instinct. "He means to come here," Caleb said grimly, "to silence us both permanently before the marshal arrives to arrest him." "We need to get to Boone," Clara said, already reaching for her shawl. "Now before—" The sound of approaching horses cut through her words, multiple riders moving fast through the still dark streets. Clara's heart lurched with terror as she peered through the shop window and saw torches, at least 6 men on horseback. Harlan Pike at their head, his face twisted with a fury she'd never seen from him before. "Clara Whitlow." Harlan's voice boomed through the pre-dawn silence, slurred with drink, but no less dangerous for it. "Come out here and face me, you meddling witch. You and your outlaw lover have destroyed everything I built." "Get back," Caleb said, pushing Clara behind him, with sudden urgency, positioning himself between her and the door, despite his weakened state. "Clara, is there a back way out? A place you can run for help?" "I'm not leaving you," Clara said fiercely. "You have to. If something happens to both of us, there's no one left to make sure the truth comes out. Please, Clara." The front window shattered suddenly, a thrown rock crashing through the glass, and Harlan's voice rose again, uglier now, unhinged with desperate fury. "Burn it down," he screamed to his men. "Same as we did the jailhouse. Let them both answer to the fire for what they've cost me." Panic seized Clara's chest, but underneath the fear, something harder crystallized, the same fierce resolve that had sent her running into a storm to save a dying stranger, the same defiance that had made her stand up to Martha Coyle and Sheriff Boone, and every whispered judgment this town had thrown at her for 2 long years. "No," she said, and her voice, though shaking, carried absolute conviction. I'm done running from this town's cruelty. I'm done letting men like Harlan Pike decide what happens to people who can't fight back on their own. Josie, go out the back. Find Boone. Tell him what's happening here. Caleb. Clara. No, you need to go too. I'm not leaving my own home to burn while I hide in the shadows, Clara said fiercely. Not this time. She moved with sudden purpose, grabbing the shotgun Thomas had kept mounted above the fireplace, an old relic she'd never once considered using in the 2 years since his death. Her hands trembled as she checked the chamber's muscle memory, guiding her through motions she'd watched Thomas perform 100 times, but never once thought she'd need herself. Clara, what are you doing? What are you? Protecting what's mine, she said, moving toward the door with a steadiness that surprised even herself. This shop, this life I've rebuilt from nothing after losing everything, I won't let Harlan Pike take it from me without a fight. She threw open the door before Caleb could stop her, stepping out onto the porch with the shotgun raised, facing down 6 mounted men and their torches, with nothing but raw courage, and Thomas's old weapon standing between her and destruction. Harlan Pike, she called out, her voice ringing clear and strong across the muddy street. You've done enough damage to this town. The forged documents, the fire that destroyed the Hendricks barn, the attempt to murder an innocent man in his jail cell. Now you want to add burning down my home to your list of crimes. Your home. Harlan laughed ugly and unhinged. This land was always meant to be mine, Clara. Thomas's little survey error was a gift I intended to correct eventually, and you and your meddling have made that far more difficult than it needed to be. There was no error, Clara said. You forged the amendment yourself, same as you paid Ezra Combs to lie about seeing Caleb at that fire. I have proof, Harlan. Real proof sitting right now in Sheriff Boone's hands waiting for the marshal to arrive. Then I suppose I have nothing left to lose. Harlan said something wild and dangerous, flashing in his eyes. Burn it down, boys. Let's see how brave the widow is when her precious shop is nothing but ash. One of the mounted men moved forward, torch raised, but before he could throw it, the sound of thundering hooves erupted from the far end of the street. Boone appeared at a dead gallop, 3 deputies flanking him, all with weapons drawn, having clearly received word from Josie faster than anyone expected. Stand down! Boone bellowed, his horse skidding to a halt in the muddy street. Harlan Pike, you're under arrest for arson, forgery, and attempted murder. Chaos erupted. Some of Harlan's men, seeing the deputies' drawn weapons and recognizing the shifted balance of power, immediately dropped their torches and raised their hands in surrender. Others hesitated, glancing toward Harlan for direction, but the man himself seemed frozen. His composed mask finally shattering completely as he realized the full weight of what was crashing down around him. This isn't over, Harlan snarled. But even as he spoke, Clara could see the fight draining out of him, the recognition that his carefully constructed empire of lies had finally irrevocably collapsed. Yes, Clara said, lowering the shotgun slightly, but not entirely. It is. Boone's deputies moved forward, pulling Harlan from his horse despite his struggles, cuffing his hands with rough efficiency. The remaining riders, seeing their leader taken, offered no further resistance, dropping their torches into the mud, where they hissed and died. You'll pay for this humiliation, Clara Whitlow, Harlan spat as the deputies dragged him away. You and your outlaw both. The only one paying for anything, Boone said grimly, is you, Harlan. Come morning, the whole county's going to know exactly what kind of man you really are. As the chaos slowly settled, deputies leading away the surrendered riders, Boone directing his men to secure the scene, Clara finally lowered the shotgun completely, her arms trembling now with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. Caleb appeared at her side, having ignored her instruction to stay hidden, his face etched with a mixture of relief and fierce admiration. You could have been killed, he said softly, standing out here facing down 6 armed men. So could you? Clara said, standing beside me every time I needed you to. I told you to stay back. And I told you I'm done being told what to do by men who think they know better than me what risks are worth taking, Clara said, though her voice carried more exhaustion than fire now that the immediate danger had passed. I'm tired, Caleb. Tired of this town's cruelty. Tired of fighting for basic respect. Tired of watching people like Harlan Pike think they can crush anyone who doesn't fit their narrow idea of what's acceptable. Caleb reached out gently, taking the shotgun from her trembling hands, setting it aside before pulling her into an embrace that neither of them questioned or hesitated over. Clara sank into it, exhaustion and relief finally overwhelming the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply standing together in the aftermath of chaos, drawing strength from each other's presence. "It's over," Caleb murmured against her hair. "Harlan's finished, Clara. Whatever comes next, at least that particular nightmare, is done." "Is it, though?" Clara pulled back slightly, meeting his eyes with lingering worry. "The land dispute, the false accusations against you, none of that disappears just because Harlan's in custody. There's still a whole investigation ahead, still questions about what happens to you once the marshal arrives." Caleb's expression sobered. "I know. But at least now the truth has a fighting chance, instead of being buried under Harlan Pike's lies and money." The morning brought Sheriff Boone back to Clara's shop, exhaustion evident in his weathered face, after a night without sleep, but purpose burning steady in his eyes. "Territorial Marshal's been sent for," he reported, accepting the coffee Clara offered with grateful hands. "Should arrive within the week to formally investigate everything: the forged documents, the fire, the attempted murder charges against Harlan. In the meantime, he's being held in the old grain storage building since we're short a proper jail at the moment." "And Caleb?" Clara asked, unable to keep the anxiety from her voice. Boone's eyes moved to where Caleb sat at the table, still recovering but stronger now than he'd been in days. "I spoke with the Hendricks family this morning, showed them the evidence you uncovered, Clara. Once they understood the full scope of Harlan's scheme, they were quick to confirm they'd never actually seen Caleb near their property that night. Ezra's testimony was fabricated entirely, just as you suspected." Relief flooded through Clara so intensely her knees nearly buckled. "Then Caleb's cleared." "Cleared of the arson charge, certainly," Boone confirmed. "As for the older matter, the horse race incident from 2 years back." He glanced at Caleb, something almost gentle in his weathered face. "That's a separate question the marshal will want to address, though. I understand there's more nuance to that situation than Harlan's version suggested." Caleb's jaw tightened, old guilt flickering across his features. "There's no nuance to it, Sheriff. A boy got hurt because of my carelessness. That much is true, whatever else Harlan twisted for his own purposes." Something in his tone made Clara's chest ache with sudden understanding. The way he'd flinched at the accusation that first night. The way he'd deflected every question about his past with careful evasion. This wasn't simple guilt over a crime he hadn't committed. This was genuine remorse, carried alone for 2 years, over something he believed he deserved to be punished for. "Caleb," she said softly, once Boone had departed to continue managing the aftermath of the night's chaos. "Tell me what really happened at that race." He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands as though the memory lived there, tangled in old calluses and half-healed scars. "There was a boy," he said finally, voice rough with old pain. "Tommy Fletcher, 16 years old, riding in his first big race, desperate to prove himself to a father who never thought much of him. I was riding too older, more experienced, and I knew that boy was pushing his horse too hard, taking risks no experienced rider would take. What happened? I could have slowed down," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Could have let him pass, given him room on that final turn instead of holding my line the way competitive instinct told me to. But I didn't. I held my ground same as any rider would in a fair race, and his horse clipped mine at the worst possible moment. He went down hard, Clara, real hard. Broke his back in the fall." Clara's hand found his gripping tight. "That's not the same as what Harlan accused you of. That's a racing accident, not deliberate cruelty." "Maybe," Caleb said. "But I've spent 2 years telling myself the same thing, and it's never made the guilt any lighter. That boy will never walk again, Clara. Never race, never live the life he dreamed of, and some nights I still hear the sound his body made hitting that ground." "So you ran," Clara said softly, understanding finally crystallizing. "Not from the law, not really. From yourself. From the guilt you couldn't outrun no matter how many miles you put behind you." Caleb's eyes lifted to meet hers, raw and exposed in a way she'd never seen from him before. I told myself I deserved to be alone, deserved to never find peace, never find comfort, because Tommy Fletcher would never walk again, and I was the reason why. That's not justice, Clara said fiercely. That's punishment you've been inflicting on yourself, on top of whatever consequences the law might have required. You made a split-second decision in a competitive race, Caleb. You didn't set out to hurt that boy. Doesn't change the outcome. No, Clara agreed. But it changes what you owe going forward. Not endless self-punishment, not running from every chance at connection or peace, but making amends where you actually can. Have you ever gone back? Ever tried to see how Tommy's doing now? Tried to help his family in whatever way you're able? Caleb's face went through several expressions, shame, longing, fear, before settling into something like dawning realization. No. I've been too afraid. Afraid of what I'd find, afraid of facing what I did. Maybe that's what real accountability looks like, Clara said gently. Not running forever, not accepting whatever punishment this world wants to throw at you, but actually facing the person you hurt, offering whatever amends you're capable of making. The conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door, this one hesitant, almost apologetic. Clara opened it to find Sheriff Boone once more, but this time his expression carried something unexpected, a kind of cautious hope she hadn't seen from him before. "There's someone here asking to speak with Rusk," Boone said. "Says it's urgent. Says it's about the race 2 years back." Clara's heart leaped into her throat, exchanging a startled glance with Caleb, before Boone stepped aside to reveal a young man standing behind him, no more than 18, thin and pale, but standing upright with the aid of 2 carved wooden canes. His legs visibly weakened, but clearly miraculously functional. "Tommy," Caleb breathed, rising unsteadily to his feet. "Tommy Fletcher." "Mr. Rusk," the young man said, his voice steady despite obvious nervousness. "I heard what's been happening here in Mercy Ridge. Heard Harlan Pike's been telling folks you crippled me on purpose using my accident to build a case against you for something you didn't do. Tommy, Caleb's voice caught guilt and shock warring across his weathered features. "I never expected. I came to set the record straight." Tommy interrupted, hobbling forward on his canes with fierce determination. "That race wasn't your fault, Mr. Rusk. I've known that for 2 years, ever since I woke up in that hospital bed and had time to really think through what happened. I pushed my horse too hard. I took a risk no sensible rider would have taken, desperate to beat a man I respected instead of racing smart. You held your line, same as any competitor would have done. What happened after that was an accident, plain and simple, not something you did to me deliberately." Tears welled in Caleb's eyes, 2 years of carried guilt suddenly cracking open at the boy's words. "I've spent 2 years believing I ruined your life, Tommy. Believing I deserved whatever punishment came my way for what happened." "You didn't ruin my life," Tommy said, something fierce and proud in his young voice. "It's different now, sure. I won't ever race again, won't walk without these canes. But I've found other things worth living for. Learned to read better than I ever did before. Started helping my pa with the accounts, since I've got time and reason to sit still now. My life's different, Mr. Rusk, but it ain't ruined." "How did you find me?" Caleb asked, still visibly shaken. "Word travels," Tommy said. "Even to a small ranch 2 counties over. When I heard Harlan Pike was using my accident to hang a false crime around your neck, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Wrote a letter to Sheriff Boone here explaining everything soon as word reached us about what was happening." Boone stepped forward, holding up a folded document. "Got this letter 3 days ago, actually. Was planning to bring it forward regardless of how things played out with the Pike investigation. But given everything else that's happened..." He glanced meaningfully at Caleb. Seemed like today was the right day for Tommy to deliver it himself. Caleb stared at the young man before him. 2 years of guilt and self-imposed exile, suddenly unexpectedly lifted by an act of grace he'd never dared hope to receive. "Thank you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means, Tommy. What this forgiveness means." "Wasn't forgiveness you needed to earn," Tommy said simply. was just the truth you needed to hear. You didn't do anything wrong that day, Mr. Rusk. Time you finally believed that yourself. Clara watched the exchange with tears in her own eyes, witnessing the visible transformation happening in Caleb before her 2 years of carried weight, finally blessedly lifting from his shoulders, leaving behind something lighter, freer, more whole than she'd seen from him since the night he'd collapsed bleeding in her yard. After Tommy departed, accompanied by Boone, who promised to ensure the young man's testimony was properly documented for the marshal's investigation, Clara and Caleb stood together in the quiet aftermath, the weight of everything that had happened finally settling into something like peace. "You heard him," Clara said softly. "It wasn't your fault, Caleb. Never was. I know that now," Caleb said, wonder still evident in his voice. 2 years, Clara. 2 years I spent running hiding, believing I deserved nothing but isolation and punishment. And it turns out the boy I thought I'd ruined has been living a full life, holding no grudge, waiting for a chance to tell me the truth I was too afraid to ask for myself. Maybe that's what healing looks like," Clara said. "Not perfect resolution, not erasing what happened, but finding a way to carry it forward without letting it define everything else about who you are." Caleb turned to face her, fully something new and vulnerable, shining in his eyes. "You did this, Clara. You're the one who pushed me to face the truth instead of running from it. If you hadn't taken me in that night, hadn't fought for me against this whole town's judgment, I'd still be running, still be carrying guilt that was never rightfully mine to bear. You did the hard part," Clara said. "Facing Tommy, facing the truth once it arrived. I just gave you a place to heal long enough to be ready for it." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither had quite named yet, something that had been building steadily through fire and false accusations, and the slow, careful work of two broken people learning to trust again. Caleb reached up gently, brushing a strand of hair from Clara's face, his touch tentative, questioning. "Clara," he said softly, "I know this isn't the time, with everything still unsettled with Harlan's case, with the marshal still to arrive and judge everything properly. But I need you to know these past weeks, finding you, finding this strange, unexpected chance at healing under your roof, it's the first time in longer than I can remember that I've felt like a life worth living was actually possible for me." Clara's breath caught her heart hammering with something that felt dangerously, wonderfully like hope. "Caleb." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted whatever she might have said next. Both of them startling apart, as a lone rider approached at a hard gallop, dust rising behind him in the morning light. Clara's stomach clenched with fresh anxiety, wondering what new crisis might be arriving to disrupt the fragile peace they'd only just begun to find. The rider pulled up hard outside the shop, and Clara recognized him with a jolt. One of the territorial marshal's deputies arrived days earlier than expected, his face grim with purpose. "Looking for a Sheriff Boone," the rider said, dismounting quickly. "And for the widow Whitlow. Got urgent business regarding a prisoner named Harlan Pike." "What kind of urgent business?" Clara asked, dread coiling tight in her stomach. The deputy's expression darkened further. "Prisoners escaped custody overnight. Marshal wants every able hand searching before he can do more damage or flee the territory entirely." Clara's blood ran cold, her eyes meeting Caleb's in matching alarm. After everything, the forgery, the fire, the attempted murder, the confrontation that had finally seemingly brought Harlan Pike to justice, the man was loose again, desperate and dangerous, with nothing left to lose, and every reason in the world to seek vengeance against the two people who had finally exposed his crimes. "Escaped how?" Boone demanded, arriving at a run, still buttoning his coat against the morning chill. "I had 2 men watching that grain store all night. One of them's missing too," the marshal's deputy said grimly. "Found the other tied up and gagged behind the flour sacks, half conscious. Says somebody came in around 3 in the morning, moved quiet, knew exactly where the guard rotation had its blind spot." "Ezra Combs," Clara said, immediately the name coming to her lips before she'd even finished thinking it through. "Has anyone checked whether Ezra's still in custody?" The deputy's face answered before he spoke a word. "Combs made bail yesterday afternoon. County judge released him pending trial, seeing as forgery and false testimony ain't capital crimes. So he had free run of the town all night," Caleb said, his jaw tight with fresh alarm. "Free enough to help his boss slip out from under armed guard. Boone swore under his breath, already turning toward his horse. I want every able man searching the roads out of town. North toward the territorial line, south toward the rail spur. Harlan's got money hidden somewhere, has to. Man like that doesn't build an empire without a way out folded up his sleeve for exactly this kind of trouble. He won't run, Clara said, suddenly something cold and certain settling into her chest. Every eye turned toward her, and she found herself speaking with a conviction she hadn't fully examined until the words were already out. Harlan Pike didn't spend 2 years scheming for my land just to abandon everything and vanish into the territory the second things went wrong. Man like that doesn't retreat. He finishes what he started, or he tries to. Meaning what exactly? Boone asked. Meaning he's not fleeing, Clara said. He's coming back here. For me, for Caleb, for anyone who stood in the way of everything he built. The words had barely left her mouth when the shop's back door, the one facing the alley, the one Josie had used to slip in unseen just nights before, creaked open on its old hinges. Every head in the room turned at once. Caleb moved first, putting himself instinctively between Clara and the doorway, his body still weak from healing, but his instincts sharp as a drawn blade. It was only Josie, breathless, her apron half untied, having clearly run the whole way from the Pike Ranch without stopping. "He's not there," she gasped, one hand braced against the doorframe. "Mr. Pike, he came back to the house not an hour ago, grabbed his strongbox from the study, and I heard him tell Ezra, I heard him say your name, Mrs. Whitlow. Said something about finishing what should have been done that first night before you ever pulled that outlaw out of the mud." Clara's stomach dropped through the floor. "Where did they go?" "I don't know," Josie said, tears of fear standing bright in her eyes. "I only heard him say he wasn't leaving Mercy Ridge until he watched your shop burn with you inside it. Please, Mrs. Whitlow, you have to hide. You have to get somewhere safe." "There's nowhere in this town safer than standing my ground," Clara said, though her pulse hammered with terror even as the words left her mouth. "Running just gives him time to plan something worse." Boone was already barking orders. Deputies scattering to cover the roads leading into town, others fanning out to search the buildings closest to Clara's shop. But something in the marshal's deputy's expression suggested he understood, same as Clara did, that a man as desperate and cornered as Harlan Pike wouldn't be caught by conventional searching. He'd wait, he'd watch, and he'd strike the moment their guard slipped even an inch. "I want you both moved somewhere more defensible," Boone said, turning to Clara and Caleb. "This shop's too exposed, too many windows, too easy a target." "Where would you suggest, Sheriff?" Caleb asked. "Man's already proven he'll burn down whatever building we're hiding in." Boone hesitated, clearly turning options over in his mind, when the sound of a single gunshot cracked through the morning air from somewhere near the edge of town, followed by shouting distant and frantic. "That came from the church," the marshal's deputy said, already moving toward his horse. "Somebody's over there." Clara's blood ran cold with sudden terrible understanding. "Reverend Wallace holds Thursday morning prayer meetings. Half the widows in town gather there, same as they have every Thursday for as long as I can remember." "You think Pike's gone after the church?" Boone asked, already swinging up into his saddle. "I think Harlan Pike wants Clara to come to him," Caleb said grimly, "and he's found the perfect way to make sure she does." They arrived at the small white church to find chaos barely contained. A handful of frightened women clustered near the door, Reverend Wallace attempting to calm them with visibly shaking hands, and Harlan Pike standing near the altar with a pistol leveled at old Mrs. Ferris, the same kind woman who'd brought Clara bread without asking a single judgmental question just weeks before. "There she is," Harlan called out the moment Clara appeared in the doorway, his voice carrying the ragged edge of a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. "Come to watch the end of this little drama you've written for yourself, Clara Whitlow." "Let her go, Harlan," Clara said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the terror clawing up her throat. "This is between you and me. Mrs. Ferris has nothing to do with any of it. Everyone in this town has something to do with it." Harlan snarled, his composed mask utterly shattered, now replaced by something wild and unhinged. "You turned them all against me. Turned Boone against me. Even my own household staff." His eyes flicked toward the doorway, clearly searching for Josie, Betrayed me for a widow and her outlaw lover. You did this to yourself, Clara said, taking a slow, deliberate step into the church despite Caleb's hand shooting out to stop her. Every choice, every lie, every act of cruelty, that was you, Harlan. Not me, not Caleb, not anyone else you're trying to blame for the consequences of your own greed. Clara, don't. Caleb's voice low and urgent, but she was already moving, already stepping further into the church with her hands raised, showing Harlan she carried no weapon this time, that she was coming to him not as an armed defender, but as someone determined to end this standoff before anyone else got hurt. Let Mrs. Ferris go, Clara said again. Take me instead if that's what you need. But don't hurt an innocent woman just to prove a point that's already lost Harlan. The marshal's investigating everything. Boone has the evidence. Whatever happens here today, your crimes are already exposed. Killing more people just adds murder to a list that's already going to see you hang. Something flickered across Harlan's face, the recognition perhaps of a truth he'd been too consumed by rage to fully process. His grip on the pistol wavered slightly, and Mrs. Ferris let out a soft, terrified sob. You've ruined everything, Harlan said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier venom, replaced by something closer to despair. 20 years, Clara. 20 years building this town, building my name, and you tore it all down in a matter of weeks because you couldn't just accept an offer for a worthless piece of land. It was never worthless to me, Clara said softly. It was Thomas's land, our land. The only thing I had left of the life we built together before Fever. Took him and our son in the same terrible week. You wanted to take the last piece of that from me, Harlan, and dress it up as a simple business transaction. That's not building a town. That's destroying whatever's left of the people who live in it. Tears, actual tears, unexpected and raw, welled in Harlan's eyes. The mask of controlled ambition finally crumbling entirely to reveal something Clara had never once considered might exist beneath his cruelty. I lost everything too, he said, voice breaking. My wife 15 years ago, my son before that stillborn. I built this empire because it was the only thing I had left that couldn't be taken from me by grief or fever or God's own indifference. And now you've taken that too. For a moment, something like sympathy flickered through Clara's chest. Recognition of a pain that mirrored her own losses. But sympathy couldn't excuse what he'd done, couldn't erase the forged documents, or the burned barn, or the attempted murders he'd orchestrated in his desperate grasping for control over a world that had already taken everything meaningful from him. Grief doesn't give you the right to destroy other people's lives, Clara said gently but firmly. I lost just as much as you did, Harlan. More, maybe. But I chose to rebuild, to help others to find meaning in small acts of kindness, instead of grasping for power that could never actually fill the hole grief left behind. You could have chosen that too. It's not too late even now to choose something different. Harlan stared at her for a long, charged moment, the pistol still trembling in his outstretched hand. Mrs. Ferris still frozen with terror before him. Then slowly, something in his shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining out of him, as the full weight of everything he'd done, everything he'd lost, everything he could never reclaim, finally crashed down all at once. It's too late for me, he said quietly. Has been for a long time now, I think. I just didn't want to admit it until this moment. He lowered the pistol. The church erupted into motion, Boone's deputies surging forward to secure the weapon. Mrs. Ferris collapsing into Reverend Wallace's steadying arms, sobs of relief echoing through the small sanctuary. Caleb was suddenly beside Clara, pulling her back from the chaos with hands that shook nearly as badly as her own. You could have been killed, he said, voice raw with fear and relief tangled together. Walking toward a man with a loaded pistol? Clara, what were you thinking? I was thinking that someone needed to remind him he still had a choice, Clara said, her own voice unsteady now that the immediate danger had passed. Even monsters started somewhere human, Caleb. Sometimes reminding them of that is the only thing that stops the worst from happening. Boone's deputies led Harlan Pike away in chains. His composed empire finally completely collapsed, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of forged documents burned buildings and a town's shattered trust in the man who'd secretly controlled so much of its fate. Ezra Combs was apprehended not an hour later, hiding in the loft of Harlan's own barn, quick to offer full testimony against his former employer in exchange for leniency in his own sentencing. The days that followed brought the territorial marshal a stern, methodical man named Wade Sutter, who spent nearly a week combing through every piece of evidence Clara had gathered. The forged survey documents, Josie's testimony about the paid false witness statements, Tommy Fletcher's letter clearing Caleb's name of any wrongdoing in the racing accident, and finally the full confession Harlan Pike offered once the reality of his situation had fully settled over him. Never seen a case unravel so completely. Marshal Sutter told Clara and Boone during his final visit before departing with Harlan and Ezra, both in custody, bound for proper trial in the territorial capital. Man had this whole county fooled for years, it seems. Would have kept fooling everyone, if not for a widow woman with more courage than half the men in this territory. I just refuse to let a stranger die in my front yard, Clara said, though warmth crept into her cheeks at the marshal's praise. Everything after that was just following the truth wherever it led. Following truth takes courage most folks don't have, Sutter said. This territory owes you a debt, Mrs. Whitlow, whether Mercy Ridge ever gets around to properly thanking you for it. As it turned out, Mercy Ridge did begin slowly and awkwardly to reckon with exactly what it owed Clara Whitlow. The transformation didn't happen all at once. Old prejudices and small-town gossip habits didn't simply evaporate because one corrupt man had finally been exposed, but something fundamental had shifted in how the town regarded the widow who'd once been whispered about for talking to ghosts on her porch. Martha Coyle was the first to arrive at Clara's shop after the dust had settled, her earlier hostility replaced by something like sheepish contrition. "I owe you an apology, Clara," Martha said, standing awkwardly in the doorway with her hands twisted together. "I said terrible things about you taking in Mr. Rusk. Never once considered that you might be the only person in this whole town brave enough to see past a man's reputation to the truth underneath." "Apology accepted," Clara said simply, though something in her chest eased at the acknowledgement, a small healing she hadn't realized she'd needed until it arrived. "We all make judgments too quickly sometimes, Martha. What matters is being willing to see clearly once the truth comes out." Others followed in their own halting ways. Wilbur Sneed from the county clerk's office profusely apologetic for his initial reluctance to produce the boundary records. Several of the townsfolk who'd whispered cruelties about Clara's supposed impropriety in housing a wanted man. Even Sheriff Boone himself, who came by one evening not on official business, but simply to express genuine gratitude. "You saved this town from something far worse than we understood," Boone said, accepting the coffee Clara offered with visible appreciation. "Harlan had his hooks into more than just your land, Clara. Half the ranchers hereabouts owed him money one way or another, mortgages he could have called due whenever it suited his purposes. If he'd succeeded in running you off in painting Rusk as the dangerous criminal he tried to make him out to be, there's no telling how much further his corruption might have spread before anyone thought to question it. I didn't do it for the town's sake," Clara admitted honestly. "I did it because a man was dying in my yard, and because I refused to let lies stand unchallenged once I understood what was really happening. Sometimes the most important things get done for the smallest, most personal reasons," Boone said. "Doesn't make them any less important in the end." Through all of this slow, uneven reckoning, Caleb remained at Clara's side, healing steadily now that the immediate danger had passed, his strength returning day by day, along with something Clara hadn't expected to see so clearly in him, a settled peace that had never existed in the exhausted, guilt-ridden drifter who'd collapsed in her yard weeks before. "You're different," Clara observed one evening watching him move about the small kitchen with an ease that hadn't been there before, helping her prepare supper without the constant watchfulness that had characterized his first days under her roof. "I feel different," Caleb admitted, setting bowls on the table with careful attention. 2 years, Clara. 2 years I spent believing I deserved nothing but isolation and guilt for what happened to Tommy. Finding out he never blamed me the way I blamed myself, it's like something that's been sitting on my chest since that race finally lifted clean away. What happens now?" Clara asked the question carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. Now that you're cleared, now that the marshals confirmed there's no charge left standing against you, where does a man go once he's finally free to stop running? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. I've been thinking about that, he said slowly. Thinking about it a great deal, actually, these past few days. And I find myself wondering whether a man who's spent 2 years running from everything might finally have found somewhere worth staying. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Caleb, I know it's complicated, he continued quickly, as though needing to get the words out before courage failed him. I know I came into your life under the worst possible circumstances, bleeding and wanted and bringing nothing but trouble to your doorstep. I know this town's still got healing to do before it fully accepts either of us without judgment. But Clara, these past weeks watching you fight for truth, even when it cost you everything, watching you choose kindness, even when this whole town gave you every reason to choose bitterness instead, I've never known anyone like you. Never expected to find something like this, not after everything I believed I'd forfeited the right to want. Clara's eyes filled with unexpected tears. 2 years of carefully guarded grief and loneliness suddenly cracking open at the raw honesty in his words. I buried my whole family, Caleb. Told myself I'd never let myself hope for anything more than simple survival ever again. But then you collapsed in my yard, and something in me, that I thought had died along with Thomas, and our boy, started waking up again, piece by piece, every single day you stayed. Is that hope? Caleb asked, softly, reaching across the small distance between them to gently cup her face. What you're describing. Because that's exactly what I feel too, Clara. Hope I never expected to find again. It might be, Clara admitted, leaning into his touch, with a trust that surprised her with its completeness. It might just be exactly that. Their first kiss was tentative, careful two broken people testing whether healing might actually be possible after everything that had shattered them both. It deepened slowly, warmth spreading through Clara's chest, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds after weeks of relentless rain. And when they finally parted, breathless and smiling in a way neither had smiled in longer than they cared to admit, something fundamental had shifted between them. No longer just two survivors clinging to shared trauma, but something that felt tentatively, dangerously, wonderfully like the beginning of real love. The town's going to talk, Clara said, though laughter bubbled beneath her words now, instead of the old anxious dread. A widow and a former wanted man courting openly not 2 months after he collapsed bleeding in her front yard. Mercy Ridge will have plenty to say about that. Let them talk, Caleb said, echoing her own words back to her with a grin that transformed his weathered face entirely. Seems to me you've spent 2 years letting this town's opinion dictate more of your happiness than it ever deserved to. Maybe it's time we both stopped asking permission to be happy. But even as joy bloomed fresh and fragile between them, the shadow of unfinished business lingered at the edges of their newfound peace. Marshal Sutter's departure with Harlan and Ezra in custody hadn't fully closed the chapter on everything the corrupt cattle buyer had set in motion. There remained the question of the mortgages Boone had mentioned, the ranchers whose debts Harlan had used as leverage for years, the tangled web of financial control that had allowed one man's corruption to spread so far beyond a simple land dispute. It was nearly 2 weeks after Harlan's departure when the true scope of his manipulation became fully apparent, arriving in the form of a nervous young banker from the territorial capital sent to audit the accounts of Mercy Ridge's small local bank at the marshal's request. Mrs. Whitlow, the banker said, having sought her out specifically at Boone's suggestion, his young face troubled beneath wire-rimmed spectacles. I believe you'll want to see what we've uncovered in reviewing Mr. Pike's financial dealings. He spread a series of documents across Clara's kitchen table ledgers, mortgage papers, correspondence that painted a picture far more disturbing than even Clara had suspected during her own investigation. Harlan Pike has been systematically acquiring debt across nearly every ranch and business in this county, the banker explained, then using threats of foreclosure to control votes, silence dissent, and manipulate local politics in his favor for years. Your situation with the boundary dispute wasn't an isolated incident, Mrs. Whitlow. It was simply the most recent chapter in a pattern that's touched nearly every family in Mercy Ridge. Clara's stomach turned as she studied the documents, recognizing names of neighbors, friends, people she'd known her whole life, all of them unknowingly trapped in Harlan Pike's web of financial coercion. The Hendricks family, she said suddenly, remembering the burned barn, the family's evident financial strain even before the fire had claimed their livelihood. Were they among those he'd trapped? The banker checked his documents, nodding grimly. Significant mortgage taken out 3 years ago to cover a bad harvest. Pike had been threatening foreclosure for months before the fire, according to the correspondence we've recovered. It appears the barn fire wasn't just about framing Mr. Rusk, it was also intended to further weaken the Hendricks family's position, make them more desperate, more likely to eventually sell their land to Pike at whatever price he chose to offer. That poor family, Clara said, horror washing through her at the full scope of Harlan's calculated cruelty. Losing their barn, their animals, and all along it was just another piece of his scheme. There's some good news at least, the banker offered. With Pike's assets seized pending trial, many of these predatory mortgage arrangements are being reviewed, and in several cases forgiven entirely or restructured under fairer terms. The Territorial Bank Commissioner takes a dim view of the kind of manipulation Pike was engaging in. Over the following weeks, the true reckoning finally arrived for Mercy Ridge. Not just the resolution of Clara's own boundary dispute, definitively confirmed in her favor with the original survey documents Thomas had properly filed years before, but a broader unraveling of corruption that touched nearly every family in the small frontier town. The Hendricks family received not just debt forgiveness, but compensation for their burned barn funded from Harlan's seized assets. Other ranchers, previously silent out of fear of foreclosure, began speaking openly about years of manipulation and quiet threats they'd endured under Pike's shadow. Clara found herself almost without realizing how it happened, becoming something of an unofficial leader in this process of healing families, seeking her advice, her support, her willingness to speak truth, even when it was uncomfortable, drawing on the same courage that had first led her to defy a rifle-wielding deputy in the pouring rain weeks before. "You've become quite the figure in this town," Caleb observed one evening, watching from the shop window, as yet another neighbor departed after seeking Clara's counsel on how best to approach the bank about restructuring their own mortgage terms. Widow Whitlow, town conscience and moral compass. "I never asked for that," Clara said, though a small smile tugged at her lips despite herself. "I just refused to stay quiet when I saw something wrong. Sometimes that's exactly how leaders are made," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her at the window, his arm settling naturally around her waist in a gesture that had become comfortable between them over the past weeks. Not through ambition or grand plans, but through simple, stubborn refusal to accept injustice when it's staring you in the face. Their relationship had deepened steadily during this period of town-wide reckoning, moving past tentative first steps into something solid and real, though both remained mindful of moving carefully, respectfully, given the weight of everything they'd both survived to reach this point. "Doc Larson says you're fully healed now," Clara mentioned one morning, watching Caleb move through his day with none of the careful stiffness that had characterized his early recovery. "No more excuses to keep you confined to my shop and kitchen." Something flickered across Caleb's face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or fear of a question neither of them had quite dared to ask outright. "Are you asking me to leave Clara?" "I'm asking what you want," Clara said carefully. "You came to Mercy Ridge running from your past, wounded and desperate. Now that past's been resolved, cleared, put to rest as much as anything so painful ever truly can be. The question is whether you still want to run, now that you're finally free to choose differently." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race despite the weeks they'd already spent growing closer. "I don't want to run anywhere," he said finally. "Not from you, not from this town, difficult as it's sometimes been. Not from whatever future might be possible if I choose to stay and build something real, instead of continuing to drift from place to place, running from ghosts that don't even chase me anymore." "Then stay," Clara said simply, the words carrying weight far beyond their brevity. "Stay, Caleb, not because you owe me anything for helping you heal, not out of obligation or gratitude, but because you actually want to build a life here with me in this town we've both fought so hard to see healed." "Is that a proposal, Clara Whitlow?" Caleb asked, something warm and teasing, entering his voice for the first time since she'd known him. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, surprised by her own boldness, even as the words had left her mouth. "Maybe it is. Would that be so terrible?" "Terrible?" Caleb laughed, the sound rich and genuine in a way that filled the small shop with warmth. "Clara, it might be the best thing anyone's ever offered me in my entire life." He pulled her close, and this kiss carried none of the tentative uncertainty of their first. Instead, something confident and sure. Two people who had weathered fire and false accusations and near-death encounters together, finally allowing themselves to fully embrace the possibility of a shared future. But even as joy bloomed between them, complications remained on the horizon. Harlan Pike's trial still pending in the territorial capital, requiring testimony from both Clara and Caleb that would force them to relive the trauma of recent weeks in a formal courtroom setting. There was also the matter of the town's ongoing healing, the slow process of restructuring mortgages and rebuilding trust that would take far longer than any single confrontation or courtroom verdict could accomplish. And there remained, too, a quieter, more personal reckoning still ahead. The question of how exactly Clara and Caleb might build a life together in a town that, despite recent apologies and grudging respect, still carried old habits of judgment that wouldn't disappear overnight, simply because one corrupt man had finally been exposed. The letter arrived 3 days later, official territorial seal stamped across its envelope, summoning both Clara Whitlow and Caleb Rusk to appear before the territorial court in 6 weeks' time, to provide testimony in the trial of Harlan Pike and Ezra Combs. Clara's hands trembled as she read the formal language, the reality of facing Harlan again, even in a controlled courtroom setting. Even with justice finally on their side, bringing back sharp echoes of that terrifying morning in the church, the pistol trembling in his desperate grip. "We'll face it together," Caleb said, reading the concern plain on her face. "Whatever the trial requires, whatever memories it forces us to relive, you won't stand alone in that courtroom, Clara. Not after everything we've already survived side by side." "I know," Clara said, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. "I just hoped foolishly, perhaps, that once he was arrested, once the truth was fully exposed, this nightmare might finally be behind us completely." "Justice takes time," Caleb said gently. "Sometimes more time than we'd like, more courage than we think we have left to give. But we'll get through it same as we've gotten through everything else these past weeks." As the date of the trial approached, Mercy Ridge continued its slow, uneven process of healing old wounds from Harlan's manipulation, surfacing gradually as families finally felt safe enough to speak honestly about years of quiet coercion. New bonds forming between neighbors who'd previously been kept isolated and suspicious of one another by Harlan's careful manipulation of information and fear. Clara found herself in quiet moments between the demands of running her shop and preparing for the upcoming trial, reflecting on just how completely her life had transformed since that stormy night when Caleb Rusk had collapsed bleeding in her front yard. She'd been so certain in the aftermath of losing Thomas and their son that her capacity for hope for connection for anything beyond simple survival had died along with them. Yet here she stood weeks later, engaged to be married to a man she'd initially known only as a wounded stranger, having weathered fire and false accusation and armed confrontation together, discovering along the way a strength and purpose she'd never known she possessed. "Penny for your thoughts," Caleb said one evening, finding her lost in contemplation as she stared out at the lantern still burning faithfully on her porch rail, the same lantern that had first drawn his stumbling horse toward her door weeks before. "I was just thinking about how strange life can be," Clara said softly. "How the worst night of near-certain loss, finding you bleeding and dying in my yard, somehow became the beginning of everything good that's followed since." "Strange indeed," Caleb agreed, settling beside her, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Though I suspect it wasn't really chance that brought us together, Clara. It was you. Your choice to help a dying stranger instead of turning away out of fear or convenience. Everything good that's followed traces back to that single decision." "Do you regret any of it?" Clara asked. "The pain, the danger, Everything you've had to face since arriving in Mercy Ridge. Caleb considered the question seriously, his eyes reflecting the lantern's warm glow. I regret the pain I've caused you being drawn into all this chaos and danger just for helping me. But the rest of it? Clara finding peace with what happened to Tommy? Finding a reason to stop running and actually build something real? None of that I'd trade for anything, however much fire and fear it took to get here. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the lantern's steady flame flicker against the deepening dusk. Two survivors who had found in each other something neither had expected to discover again after everything life had already taken from them. The trial still loomed ahead, 6 weeks of preparation and anxious anticipation before they'd finally see Harlan Pike brought to full account for his crimes. But for this quiet evening at least, wrapped in each other's presence beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars, both Clara and Caleb allowed themselves simply to feel grateful for having found their way to this moment at all. The peace, however, would prove short-lived. 3 weeks before the scheduled trial, a writer arrived from the territorial capital bearing news that would shake Mercy Ridge to its foundations. Once more, Harlan Pike, awaiting trial in the territorial jail, had somehow managed to bribe a guard and escape custody, entirely vanishing into the vast, unforgiving wilderness beyond the reach of any immediate pursuit. Boone's fist came down hard on Clara's table, rattling the coffee cups. Bribed a guard with money we never even found. Man's been planning a second escape since the moment they clapped him in irons, I'd wager on it. Where would he go? Clara asked, though dread already told her the answer before Boone spoke it aloud. Territorial Marshal thinks he'll run for the border, Boone said. But I know Harlan Pike better than most men in this county, and I don't believe that for 1 second. A man like that doesn't run from what's his. He comes back to finish it. Caleb was already on his feet, moving toward the gun cabinet with a grim purpose that had nothing left of the wounded drifter who'd once needed Clara's hands to keep him from bleeding out. Then we don't wait for him to choose the time and place again. We get ahead of it. Caleb. No Clara. He turned to face her, and there was something new in his eyes now, something steady and clear that hadn't been there even in the church when he'd stood trembling with fear for her life. Twice now that man's tried to burn us both alive. Twice he's used fire and fear to try and take what isn't his. I won't wait around wondering when he's going to try a third time. Boone's jaw tightened. I can't have you riding out playing lawman Rusk. That's a good way to end up back in a cell, whatever your intentions. Then deputize me, Caleb said simply. Official and proper, so there's no question about it after. I know this land better than half your men. Sheriff spent 2 years drifting through territory most folks never bother to learn. If Harlan's hiding anywhere within riding distance, I can help find him faster than waiting on word from the capital. Boone studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer against years of careful caution, before finally nodding once sharp and decisive. Raise your right hand, then. Let's make this official before anybody can say otherwise. Clara watched heart hammering with a complicated mixture of pride and terror as Caleb repeated the oath Boone administered, transforming in the span of a few simple words from healed fugitive to sworn deputy of Mercy Ridge. It was, she realized, the final piece of his redemption arc clicking into place. Not just cleared of false charges, not just forgiven for old guilt, but now entrusted with the very authority that had once hunted him as a wanted man. I'm coming too, Clara said, already reaching for her shawl. Clara, no. Both men spoke at once, identical alarm crossing their faces. I found the forged documents. I gathered the evidence that exposed him in the first place. I know how his mind works better than either of you, Clara said, standing her ground with the same fierce determination that had carried her through every confrontation since the night Caleb collapsed in her yard. I won't sit here waiting, wondering if the man I love is riding into an ambush because I stayed safely behind. The word hung in the air between them, love spoken for the first time, and Caleb's expression softened, even amid the tension of the moment, something tender flickering behind the urgency. You could be killed, he said quietly. So could you, Clara said. Same argument you lost last time, if you'll recall. I'm not staying behind Caleb, not this time. Boone sighed heavily, clearly recognizing a losing battle when he saw one. Fine, but you stay behind whoever's riding point, And the second things turn dangerous, you fall back. Agreed? Agreed, Clara said, though both men could see in her eyes that the promise carried more flexibility than either would have preferred. They rode out within the hour, a small posse of Boone's deputies, joined by Caleb and Clara, following a trail that led north from the territorial jail toward the rougher country bordering Mercy Ridge Canyonland, sparse and unforgiving, the kind of terrain a desperate man might choose precisely because pursuit would be slow and dangerous. It was nearly dusk when they found the first sign, a campfire recently abandoned, still smoldering faintly in a narrow gulch that offered natural shelter from the wind and from prying eyes. Caleb dismounted first, crouching to examine the tracks pressed into the soft earth around the fire pit. 2 horses, he said quietly. Pike's not alone. Ezra Combs escaped 2-3 days back, Boone said grimly. Guessed he might have helped arrange Pike's second run at freedom given how quick they were caught working together the first time. Tracks head further into the canyon, Caleb said, straightening. Recent, maybe an hour old at most. If we push now, we might catch them before full dark. Boone hesitated, glancing at the darkening sky, weighing the tactical risk of pursuing into unfamiliar canyon terrain against the danger of losing the trail entirely if they waited for morning. All right, but careful all of you. This is exactly the kind of ground a desperate man would choose for an ambush. They pressed forward cautiously, the canyon walls rising steep and shadowed on either side the horses' hooves, muffled against sandy ground that swallowed sound in a way that left everyone's nerves stretched taut with anticipation. Clara kept close behind Caleb, her heart hammering with every shift of shadow, every whisper of wind through the rocks above. The ambush came without warning. A gunshot cracked from somewhere above, echoing violently off the canyon walls, and Boone's horse reared in panic as a bullet struck the ground inches from its hooves. Chaos erupted instantly. Deputies scattering for cover, horses screaming and bucking. Caleb pulling Clara from her saddle and dragging her behind a jumble of boulders as a second shot rang out. Pike! Boone shouted, his voice raw with fury, as he too scrambled for cover. Show yourself, you coward! Coward! Harlan's voice echoed down from somewhere above, carrying a wild, unhinged edge that made Clara's blood run cold. I built this county with my own 2 hands, Boone, and you call me a coward for refusing to let a widow and her outlaw tear it all down. It's over, Harlan, Clara called out, her voice steadier than she felt, pressed close against the rough stone with Caleb's arm braced protectively around her. The marshal has everything. The forged documents, the confessions, Tommy Fletcher's testimony. Running won't change any of it. Then I've got nothing left to lose by finishing what I started, Harlan shouted back, and another shot rang out, this one striking close enough to send stone chips scattering across Clara's shoulder. Caleb's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the canyon rim above with the sharp, focused attention of a man who'd spent 2 years surviving alone in wild country. He's up on that ridge maybe 40 yards, using the rocks for cover, same as we are. Ezra's probably with him, watching our flank. We're pinned down, Boone said grimly from his own position behind a fallen log. Can't advance without exposing ourselves, can't retreat without giving him a clear shot at our backs. I can circle around, Caleb said. Come at him from the side while he's watching your position. Caleb, no. Clara's grip on his arm tightened instinctively. It's the only way, Clara. His eyes met hers steady, despite the danger carrying none of the desperate fatalism that had once defined the wounded drifter who'd first collapsed in her yard. I've survived worse odds than this alone with nobody watching my back. This time, I've got Boone's men covering me, and a reason to come back besides just staying alive out of habit. He kissed her quickly, fiercely, before she could argue further, then was gone, moving low and fast along the canyon floor, using every rock and shadow for cover, with a practiced ease that spoke to years of hard-won survival instinct. Clara watched him disappear around a bend in the canyon wall, her heart in her throat praying with an intensity she hadn't felt since the fever had taken Thomas and their son. The gunfire continued sporadically, Boone and his deputies exchanging fire with Harlan's position to keep his attention fixed forward, buying Caleb the time he needed to circle unseen. Minutes stretched into an eternity of tension, Clara pressed against cold stone, straining to hear any sign of what was happening beyond her line of sight. Then suddenly a new voice rang out from above Caleb's sharp with authority. "Drop it, Harlan! It's over!" A scuffle, the sound of bodies colliding, a pistol discharging wildly into empty air, and then silence, heavy, uncertain silence that seemed to stretch forever before Boone finally called out cautiously. "Rusk, you all right up there?" "I'm fine." Caleb's voice breathless but strong. "Got him. Sheriff Ezra ran the second things went bad, but I've got Pike secured." Relief flooded through Clara so completely her knees nearly buckled. She scrambled up from behind the boulders, ignoring Boone's shouted warning, to wait for the all-clear, desperate to see with her own eyes that Caleb had truly survived the confrontation unharmed. She found him at the top of the ridge, one knee pressed into Harlan Pike's back. The older man's wrists bound tight with a length of rope Caleb had apparently carried for exactly this purpose. Harlan's face was a mask of defeat now, all traces of his earlier wild defiance drained away, replaced by something hollow and exhausted. "It's finished, Harlan," Caleb said, hauling the man to his feet with rough efficiency. "For real this time. No more escapes, no more schemes. Just you answering for everything you've done." Harlan said nothing, his eyes finding Clara's. For a long charged moment, something unreadable passing between them, before he looked away entirely. Defeat finally completely settling into his broken posture. "Ezra?" Boone asked, arriving at the top of the ridge with his deputies close behind. "Ran west," Caleb reported. "Didn't have the stomach for a real fight once his boss went down. We can send trackers after him once we've got Pike secure, but I don't imagine he'll get far. Man like that's not built for surviving alone out here." Boone nodded grimly, taking custody of Harlan with visible satisfaction. "This time, there won't be any grain storage buildings or convenient guard rotations. Territorial jails got proper cells, proper security. He's not slipping free again." As the deputies secured their prisoner and began the process of preparing for the ride back to Mercy Ridge, Clara finally allowed herself to close the distance between herself and Caleb, wrapping her arms around him with a fierceness that spoke of every terrified moment she'd endured while he'd circled alone into danger. "Don't ever do that again," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Don't ever make me watch you walk into danger without me at your side." "I had to end it, Clara," Caleb said softly, his arms tightening around her. "Had to make sure this time truly and completely that he'd never threaten you or this town again." "I know," she said, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. "I know, and I understand why. Doesn't mean my heart didn't nearly stop the whole time you were gone." "I'm here," Caleb said, cupping her face with hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. "I'm here, Clara, and I'm not going anywhere. Not now, not ever again." The ride back to Mercy Ridge felt different from the tense, fearful journey out, lighter, somehow, despite the exhaustion weighing on everyone after the day's dangerous confrontation. Harlan Pike rode bound and silent among Boone's deputies, his empire of lies and manipulation finally truly at its end, while Clara and Caleb rode close together at the rear of the procession, their hands finding each other whenever the terrain allowed, neither quite ready to release the physical connection that had carried them both through so much danger and fear. Ezra Combs was captured 3 days later, exactly as Caleb had predicted, found half-starved and desperate near the territorial line, quick to offer whatever testimony might reduce his own sentence once faced with the reality of survival alone in unforgiving wilderness. With both men finally secured in proper territorial custody, the long-delayed trial proceeded on its original schedule, 6 weeks later, in a courtroom packed with witnesses from Mercy Ridge and the surrounding county, all eager to see justice finally completely served. Clara's testimony took the better part of a full day, walking the court through every piece of evidence she'd gathered, the forged boundary documents, Josie's account of the paid false testimony, the confession Harlan himself had offered in the moment of his defeat inside the small church. Caleb's testimony followed, detailing not just the false accusations against him, but the broader pattern of manipulation Harlan had used to control the county's ranchers through predatory mortgages and calculated fear. Tommy Fletcher traveled the long distance to testify as well. His letter and subsequent statement definitively clearing Caleb's name of any wrongdoing in the racing accident that had haunted him for 2 long years. The young man's forgiveness offered publicly and completely closing a chapter of guilt that had defined so much of Caleb's exile from any real connection or peace. The verdict, when it finally came, surprised no one. In its severity, Harlan Pike sentenced to 20 years for arson, forgery, attempted murder, and financial fraud, spanning nearly a decade of calculated manipulation. Ezra Combs, having offered full cooperation, received a lighter sentence of 5 years, though the shame of his betrayal would likely follow him far longer than any prison term could enforce. "It's really over," Clara said, standing outside the territorial courthouse in the bright afternoon sun, watching as deputies led Harlan Pike away in chains toward the wagon that would transport him to serve his lengthy sentence. "After everything, the fire, the forgeries, the church, the canyon, it's finally truly over. It is." Caleb confirmed, his arm settling naturally around her shoulders as they watched the wagon pull away, carrying with it the last remnants of Harlan Pike's corrupt empire. "Whatever comes next, Clara, we face it as free people. No more hidden threats, no more forged documents lurking in county records, no more wondering when the next attack might come." They returned to Mercy Ridge to find a town transformed in ways neither had quite anticipated. Not perfect, not entirely free of old prejudices or small-town gossip habits, but fundamentally changed by the shared experience of surviving Harlan Pike's manipulation together. Families who'd once been isolated by fear and financial coercion now gathered openly, sharing stories of relief at debts, forgiven mortgages, restructured under fair terms. A community slowly rebuilding trust that had been systematically eroded over years of hidden corruption. Reverend Wallace organized a special service of Thanksgiving the Sunday after their return, the small church packed beyond capacity, with townsfolk eager to mark the formal end of the crisis that had gripped Mercy Ridge for months. Clara found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, asked to speak before the assembled congregation, Boone and Reverend Wallace both insisting that her voice, more than anyone else's, had earned the right to mark this moment of communal healing. She stood at the front of the small church, the same sanctuary where she'd once faced down Harlan Pike's pistol, with nothing but raw courage and desperate hope, and looked out at faces that had once whispered cruel judgments about her supposed impropriety, now watching her instead, with something closer to genuine respect and gratitude. "2 years ago," she began, her voice carrying clear and steady through the hushed sanctuary, "I lost my husband and my son within 4 days of each other. I remember thinking in those darkest weeks that I'd never again find reason to hope for anything beyond simple survival. I lit a lantern every night, not because I believed it might guide anyone home, but because it was the only ritual I had left to mark the family I'd lost." She paused, finding Caleb's eyes among the crowd, drawing strength from his steady, encouraging presence. "Then one stormy night, a wounded stranger collapsed in my front yard, and something in me that I thought had died along with my family finally woke up again. Not romance, not at first, just simple humanity. The recognition that a dying man needed help, regardless of what this town's gossip might say about the impropriety of a widow tending a stranger's wounds." Murmurs rippled through the congregation, some faces flushing with obvious embarrassment at memories of their own earlier judgment. "That choice," Clara continued, "to help, despite what others might think, taught me something I'd forgotten in my grief, that kindness offered without expectation of reward, without concern for reputation or convenience, has a way of unlocking truths that fear and suspicion could never uncover. Because I chose to help Caleb Rusk, I discovered a pattern of corruption that had been quietly strangling this county for years. Because I refused to accept convenient lies, this town finally found the courage to speak truthfully about debts and fears we'd all been too frightened to acknowledge openly." She looked out at the crowd, seeing Martha Coyle wiping tears from her eyes, seeing Wilbur Sneed nodding solemnly, seeing dozens of familiar faces that had once judged her harshly, now offering something closer to genuine understanding. "I don't say any of this to claim credit for what's happened," Clara said. "I say it because I believe this town needed to remember something important. That judgment offered too quickly, cruelty disguised as propriety, fear masquerading as caution. These things can blind us to truths that only compassion and courage together can uncover. Harlan Pike built his empire of lies partly because this town was too willing to accept convenient narratives instead of asking harder questions. I hope, going forward, we've all learned something about the cost of easy judgment and the value of simple human kindness. The congregation rose in spontaneous, sustained applause, faces wet with tears, Boone himself standing to add his own gruff voice to the tribute. Clara stepped down from the front of the church, overwhelmed by emotion, finding herself immediately enfolded in Caleb's steady embrace. "You did that?" he murmured against her hair. "Changed this whole town's understanding of what really matters just by refusing to let fear dictate your choices." "We did that," Clara corrected softly. "Together, Caleb. From that very first night." The wedding took place 3 weeks later. A simple ceremony held in the same small church, Reverend Wallace officiating with visible joy as he pronounced Clara Whitlow and Caleb Rusk husband and wife, before a congregation that had transformed over the difficult months since Caleb's arrival from suspicious judges into genuine community, celebrating a hard-won happiness. Martha Coyle organized the reception herself, insisting on providing the finest spread Mercy Ridge could offer as penance for her earlier harsh words. Mrs. Ferris, still visibly shaken from her ordeal in the church, but grateful beyond measure for her rescue, presented Clara with a beautifully embroidered quilt as a wedding gift, tears streaming freely as she embraced the woman she'd once whispered cruel judgments about. Even Sheriff Boone, gruff and typically reserved, offered an unexpectedly warm toast during the celebration. "Never thought I'd see the day Clara Whitlow found happiness again after everything this town watched her endure," he said, raising his glass to the assembled crowd. "But I reckon sometimes the deepest healing comes from the most unexpected places. Here's to Clara and Caleb. May this town never again make the mistake of judging someone before knowing the full truth of their heart." The celebration continued late into the evening, laughter and music filling the small church hall in a way that felt like genuine communal joy, rather than the performative politeness Clara had grown accustomed to enduring from Mercy Ridge over the 2 lonely years of her widowhood. Later that evening, as the celebration finally began winding down, Clara found herself standing alone for a rare quiet moment on the church steps, watching the stars begin to emerge overhead when Caleb joined her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Regretting anything?" he asked softly, settling beside her. "Never," Clara said immediately, leaning into his warmth. "Though I find myself thinking about Thomas tonight, about how strange it feels being this happy again, when for so long I believed happiness itself had died along with him and our son." Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I don't think loving me erases what you shared with Thomas, Clara. I think it just proves your heart's capable of holding more than one kind of love, even after loss, that should have destroyed it entirely. When did you become so wise about matters of the heart?" Clara asked, a teasing warmth entering her voice despite the emotional weight of the moment. "I had a good teacher," Caleb said, smiling. "Woman who taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting what came before, just learning to carry it forward into something new." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching stars multiply across the darkening sky, 2 survivors who had found against every reasonable expectation a genuine second chance at happiness together. The months that followed brought their own quieter challenges and joys. Caleb formally taking up permanent work as one of Boone's deputies, his knowledge of wilderness survival and his hard-won wisdom about second chances, making him uniquely suited to handle the county's difficult cases with compassion tempered by genuine understanding. Clara's sewing shop flourished as never before, townsfolk no longer approaching her business with the wary suspicion that had once characterized their interactions, but instead with genuine warmth and gratitude for everything she'd sacrificed to expose Harlan Pike's corruption. Josie, the brave young servant girl whose courage in coming forward had proven so crucial to unraveling Harlan's schemes, found herself welcomed into Clara and Caleb's growing circle of close friends, eventually taking up an apprenticeship in Clara's shop that offered her far more security and dignity than her previous position in Harlan's household had ever provided. Tommy Fletcher visited twice more over the following year. His friendship with Caleb, deepening into something like genuine brotherhood, the young man's presence serving as a constant gentle reminder of how thoroughly redemption and forgiveness could transform even the deepest guilt into something bearable, even meaningful. "You know," Tommy said during one such visit, watching Caleb help him dismount with the careful, practiced ease that had become second nature between them. "I used to wonder in those first months after the accident whether anything good could possibly come from what happened to me. Now I look at everything that's unfolded, you finding Clara, this whole town finally getting free of Harlan Pike's corruption, and I can't help thinking maybe even the worst moments serve some larger purpose we can't always see clearly at the time." "Maybe," Caleb said, though old grief still flickered briefly behind his eyes at the memory. "Though I'll always wish it hadn't cost you your ability to race Tommy, whatever good's come from it since." "I've made my peace with that," Tommy said firmly. "You should make yours too, Caleb. Fully and completely, not just in fits and starts whenever guilt manages to sneak back in." It was advice Caleb took seriously, gradually learning over the following months to accept Tommy's forgiveness not as something he needed to constantly re-earn, but as a genuine gift, freely given, allowing himself finally to release the last vestiges of guilt that had defined so much of his exile before Clara had pulled him from the mud and refused to let him die alone. A year after that fateful stormy night, Mercy Ridge gathered once more, this time for a celebration of an entirely different kind, the christening of Clara and Caleb's first child. A daughter they named Grace, in recognition of everything unexpected mercy and forgiveness had brought into both their lives. Standing at the church font, watching Reverend Wallace bless their infant daughter before a congregation that had once judged Clara so harshly for daring to help a wounded stranger, Clara found herself overwhelmed by the completeness of the transformation that had unfolded across that single remarkable year. "She's beautiful," Martha Coyle said, admiring the sleeping infant afterward. Her earlier hostility toward Clara now replaced entirely by genuine warmth and friendship that had grown steadily over months of shared community rebuilding. "You've built quite a life for yourself, Clara. More than any of us deserve to see you find, given how harshly this town once treated you." "The past is past," Clara said simply, though gratitude for the town's genuine transformation warmed her chest as she spoke the words. "What matters now is what we build going forward together, having finally learned the cost of judging too quickly and loving too cautiously." That evening, after the celebration had concluded and their daughter finally settled into peaceful sleep, Clara and Caleb sat together on the porch of the home they'd built together, larger now than the small shop where their story had first begun, but still marked by the same lantern Clara had faithfully lit every night since Thomas's passing, now burning not for ghosts of the past, but as a welcoming beacon for whatever future still lay ahead. "Do you remember?" Caleb said softly, watching the lantern's steady flame, "that first night, when you asked me if I'd eaten?" "I remember," Clara said, smiling at the memory, despite everything terrible that had followed in those early days. Simplest question in the world, and somehow it changed everything. "It did?" Caleb agreed, pulling her closer against his side. "That question was the first door back to life I'd found in 2 long years of running. You didn't ask about my crimes, my reputation, my past. You just asked if I'd eaten like my basic humanity mattered more than whatever the world had decided to label me." "Because it did matter," Clara said. "It always matters, Caleb. Underneath every label this world tries to force on people, outlaw, widow, criminal, victim, there's just a person hungry and hurting and hoping for someone to see past the surface to the truth underneath." They sat together in comfortable silence, the lantern's flame steady between them. Their daughter sleeping peacefully inside the home they'd built from the ashes of tragedy and corruption both had endured before finding each other. "I used to think," Clara said quietly, "that this lantern was just for the dead. A ritual to honor Thomas and our boy, a way of keeping their memory alive, even as the rest of my life felt increasingly empty and purposeless." "And now?" Caleb asked. "Now I think it's always been about hope," Clara said, watching the flame dance gently in the evening breeze. Hope that somewhere out there someone lost and hurting might find their way home same as you did that stormy night. Hope that even the darkest circumstances can transform into something meaningful if we're brave enough to choose compassion over fear, truth over convenient lies. Caleb pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke his response. You gave me that home, Clara. Not just this house, not just this town that's finally learned to accept both of us without judgment, but a home in the truest sense. A place where I'm known completely, flaws and guilt and all, and loved regardless. We gave each other that, Clara corrected softly. Two broken people finding in each other exactly what we'd both stopped believing we deserved to find again. Inside their home, their infant daughter stirred briefly in her sleep before settling once more into peaceful rest, safe and warm within walls that had witnessed both tremendous suffering and ultimately profound healing. Outside, the lantern continued its steady burn against the gathering darkness, no longer a solitary widow's lonely ritual, but a shared light between two people who had chosen against every reasonable expectation to build something lasting from the wreckage of their separate tragedies. Mercy Ridge itself had changed permanently in ways both subtle and profound. Old prejudices not entirely erased, but tempered now by hard-won understanding of how quickly convenient judgment could obscure genuine truth. Families once trapped by Harlan Pike's predatory financial manipulation now thrived under fair terms and renewed community trust. The Hendricks family had rebuilt their barn twice the size of the original, their prosperity, a visible testament to justice, finally properly served. Even Wilbur Sneed, the nervous county clerk who had once trembled at the mere mention of crossing Harlan Pike, now served as an unofficial guardian of transparent, honest record-keeping, determined never again to let fear compromise the integrity of public documents entrusted to his care. Sheriff Boone, having witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of corruption left unchecked, dedicated himself with renewed vigor to ensuring Mercy Ridge would never again fall prey to a single man's manipulation of power and fear. Caleb served faithfully at his side, his own hard-won wisdom about redemption and second chances informing an approach to law enforcement that balanced necessary justice with genuine compassion for those caught in difficult, complicated circumstances. Josie eventually opened her own small dress shop 2 doors down from Clara's original establishment, the two women maintaining a close friendship built on shared courage during the darkest days of Harlan Pike's reign of manipulation and fear. Tommy Fletcher, meanwhile, had found his own unexpected calling, using his skill with numbers and accounts to help other ranchers navigate the complex process of restructuring debts that Harlan had once weaponized against them, ensuring that no family in the county would ever again suffer the kind of predatory financial control that had nearly destroyed so many lives. As for Harlan Pike himself, reports occasionally filtered back from the territorial prison where he served his lengthy sentence, a broken man by all accounts, stripped entirely of the wealth and influence that had once made him seem invincible. Forced finally to reckon with the true cost of choosing power and control over genuine human connection. Clara felt when she thought of him at all. Not vindictive satisfaction, but something closer to sorrowful pity, recognizing in his downfall the tragic consequence of grief transformed into corrosive greed, rather than the compassionate rebuilding she herself had chosen to pursue. Years later, when their daughter Grace had grown old enough to ask about the lantern that still burned faithfully every evening on their porch rail, Clara would tell her the whole story. The storm, the wounded stranger, the fire and false accusations and desperate confrontations that had nearly destroyed everything before finally decisively giving way to justice and lasting love. "Why do you still light it every night, Mama?" Grace would ask, watching the flame flicker to life in her mother's steady hands. "Because hope needs tending, same as any living thing." Clara would answer the same words Thomas had once spoken to her in the earliest days of their own marriage, passed down now to a new generation. Because somewhere out there, someone lost and hurting might need to see a light showing them the way home, same as your father did on the worst night of his life and the best night of mine. Caleb, listening from the porch steps, would smile at the familiar story at watching his wife pass down to their daughter the same fierce compassion and unshakable hope that had first drawn him back from the edge of death and despair into a life he'd never believed himself worthy of receiving. The lantern burned on, steady and warm against the vast darkness of the frontier night, no longer marking grief alone, but standing instead as testament to everything possible. When courage triumphs over fear, when truth prevails over convenient lies, and when two broken people choose against every reasonable expectation to build a home together from the very ashes of everything that once threatened to destroy them both completely. Clara Whitlow Rusk had learned through fire and loss, and finally, through love, reclaimed that home was never simply a place carved from wood and stone. Home was a person who stayed through storms, through lies, through every trial this hard world could throw, against two hearts determined to heal together, rather than break apart alone. And in Mercy Ridge, beneath a lantern that would burn faithfully for decades still to come, that home endured complete, unshakable, and finally entirely at peace.